Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you are watching, and please don't forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. What if everything you've ever known is a lie? What if this moment you listen to these words, you're not actually hearing them at all? What if the room around you, the sensations in your body, the memories you hold dear, the very ground beneath your feet, what if none of it is real? This isn't a question designed to frighten you. It's an invitation to embark on one of the most profound journeys in human thought. A journey that begins in absolute doubt and ends in absolute certainty. A journey that will strip away everything we think we know until we discover the one thing that cannot be doubted, cannot be destroyed, cannot be erased. Tonight, we walk with a man who dared to question reality itself. A man who sat alone in a heated room on a cold November night in 1619, somewhere in southern Germany, and decided to demolish everything, every belief, every assumption, every truth he'd ever held. And in the ruins of that demolition, he found something remarkable, something unshakable. His name was René Descartes, and his method of radical doubt changed the course of Western philosophy forever. But before we reach that moment of discovery, we must first learn to doubt. Really doubt. Not the casual skepticism we apply to politicians or advertisements, but a deep, methodical, almost surgical doubt. A doubt so complete that it threatens to swallow everything, including ourselves. Are you ready? Then let us begin this meditation together. Let us strip away the false, the uncertain, the merely probable. Let us discover what remains when everything else falls away. Close your eyes if you wish. Settle into this moment. And let us journey from doubt to certainty, from darkness to light, from confusion to clarity. Our story begins not with philosophy, but with a dream. René Descartes was born in 1596 in the Loire Valley of France, in a small town then called La Haye, Touraine. His mother died when he was just over a year old, leaving him to be raised by his grandmother, while his father, a councillor in the Parliament of Brittany, travelled extensively. This early loss, this early absence, perhaps planted the first seeds of the profound loneliness that would characterize his philosophical method. The philosopher who begins from the isolated self, stripped of all external authority, may have learned that isolation early. As a child, René was frail and sickly. The Jesuit school where he studied, the College of La Flèche, granted him special permission to stay in bed late into the morning. This habit would remain with him throughout his life, doing his most profound thinking in the quiet hours of dawn, lying in bed, lost in thought. It's a beautiful image, isn't it? The philosopher as dreamer, the thinker who finds truth not in the bustle of the world, but in the stillness of contemplation. At La Flèche, young Descartes received what was considered the finest education available. In Europe, the Jesuits were masters of pedagogy, drilling their students in logic, mathematics, natural philosophy, metaphysics, and ethics. He excelled at mathematics, finding in its clear and distinct proofs a kind of certainty that eluded him in other subjects. When he studied geometry, when he worked through algebraic problems, he encountered truths that seemed immune to doubt. 2 plus 2 would always equal 4. The angles of a triangle would always sum to 180 degrees. Here was knowledge that seemed rock solid, built on unshakable foundations. But in other subjects, philosophy, theology, Physics found only dispute and disagreement. Different authorities said different things. Ancient texts contradicted each other. What one philosopher held as certain, another demolished. The young Descartes began to wonder, how can we know anything at all? How can we build a science, a philosophy, a worldview that isn't just the opinion of this or that scholar, but something objectively true? After completing his studies in 1616, he took a law degree at the University of Poitiers, but law didn't satisfy him. The life of a provincial lawyer held no appeal. So in 1618, at the age of 22, he enlisted in the army of Prince Maurice of Nassau in the Dutch Republic. Not because he sought military glory, but because military service offered something precious: time to think, and the opportunity to travel. It was during his military service that Descartes met Isaac Beeckman, a Dutch scientist and mathematician, who would become an important intellectual companion. Beeckman encouraged Descartes' mathematical talents and his interest in physics. Together they discussed the nature of sound, the fall of bodies, the principles of hydrostatics. But more than specific problems, Beeckman gave Descartes something invaluable: confidence that his own mind could discover truths about nature through reason and mathematics. Then came the dreams. On November 10th, 1619, Descartes was stationed near Meran, Ulm in southern Germany. The day was cold, and he spent it in a polar-heated room, possibly his own quarters or a public warming room. Alone with his thoughts, withdrawn from the external world, he meditated intensely on mathematics and philosophy. That night, he had 3 dreams that he would later describe as among the most important experiences of his life. In the first dream, he was buffeted by a whirlwind and tried to reach a church for refuge. He was spinning, unable to stand straight, while others around him seemed stable and steady. He felt a terrible weakness on his right side and struggled to stand. When he woke, he felt a sharp pain and feared some evil demon had tried to seduce him. In the second dream, he heard a loud crack like thunder and saw bright sparks fill the room. He woke in terror. In the third and final dream, the atmosphere was calmer. He found a dictionary on his table and then an anthology of poetry. Opening the anthology, he found a verse beginning, "Quod fati sectabor ita." What path shall I follow in life? A stranger appeared and showed him another verse, beginning, est et nan, yes and no. Upon waking from this third dream, Descartes didn't go back to sleep. Instead, he spent the rest of the night interpreting his dreams. He concluded that they represented a divine mission. He was being called to unify all knowledge, to develop a universal method that would establish the foundations of the sciences with mathematical certainty. The dictionary represented all the sciences gathered together. The anthology represented philosophy and wisdom united. The verse, "What path shall I follow in life?" was the young man's question at the crossroads. And yes and no, truth and falsehood, represented the choice before him and all humanity. Whether we believe in the prophetic nature of dreams or not, there's something deeply moving about this young man, alone in a heated room, having what felt like a divine revelation. From that night forward, Descartes had his mission: to find a method, a way of thinking that would lead with certainty from what we can know to what we need to discover. But how do you begin such a project? Where do you start when you want to rebuild all of human knowledge from the ground up? Descartes realized something radical. You start by tearing everything down. You begin with doubt, not with assertion. You question everything until you find something that cannot be questioned. And only then, only once you've found that unshakable foundation, do you begin to build upward again. After his time in military service, Descartes traveled extensively throughout Europe. He visited courts and cities, met scholars and scientists, observed different customs and beliefs. This travel confirmed his suspicion. People believe wildly different things. What's considered obvious in one place is rejected in another. What one culture holds as sacred truth, another dismisses as superstition. Isn't it strange, Descartes thought, that we trust our education, our upbringing, our cultural inheritance, when we can see so clearly that accident of birth determines so much of what we believe? If you'd been born in Paris, you'd believe one set of things. Born in Constantinople, another. Born in Beijing, yet another. How can any of these beliefs claim to be universally true when they're so obviously dependent on geography and culture? This led Descartes to a powerful resolve. He would treat his mind like a house that needed complete renovation. You can't just patch up a house with weak foundations. You have to tear it down to the foundation stones, inspect those stones, throw away the cracked ones, and rebuild from the ground up with solid materials. That's what he would do with his beliefs. But there was a problem. While you're renovating your house, where do you live? While you're doubting all your beliefs and rebuilding your knowledge, how do you navigate daily life? Descartes' solution was elegant. He would adopt a provisional moral code to live by while he did his philosophical work. Don't try to revolutionize your life and your philosophy at the same time. Live by the customs and laws of your country. Act decisively once you've chosen a path, even if you're not certain. It's the best path. Master your own desires rather than trying to change the world. And above all, devote yourself to the cultivation of reason. With this practical framework in place, Descartes could safely embark on his radical philosophical project. He would spend the next 20 years developing his philosophy and his science. He moved to the Netherlands in 1628, seeking the relative intellectual freedom and privacy that country offered. Over these 2 decades, he worked on mathematics, optics, meteorology, physiology, and above all, philosophy. He conducted dissections. He ground lenses. He calculated trajectories. He pondered the nature of light and color, but always at the center of his work was that fundamental question that had haunted him since his youth: how can we know anything with certainty? In 1641, after years of work, he published his masterpiece, Meditations, De Prima Philosophiam, Meditations on First Philosophy. It was written in Latin, the universal language of European scholarship, and it was structured not as a treatise, but as a series of 6 meditations, 6 days of philosophical exercises, each building on the last, taking the reader on the same journey Descartes himself had undertaken. The structure was deliberate. This wasn't a book to be merely read. It was meant to be experienced, meditated upon. The reader was meant to doubt alongside Descartes, to feel the vertigo of radical skepticism, and then to discover, step by step, what can be known with certainty. But before we explore those meditations, we need to understand something about the world Descartes lived in. This was the early 17th century. Europe was torn by religious wars. The Protestant Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation had shattered the medieval synthesis. Science was beginning to challenge ancient authorities. Galileo's telescope had revealed moons around Jupiter, contradicting Aristotelian cosmology. But Galileo had been forced to recant his views under threat of torture by the Inquisition. In this world of conflict and uncertainty, where people killed each other over theological disagreements, and where simply publishing the wrong scientific claim could end your career or your life, Descartes sought something radical. A foundation for knowledge that didn't depend on authority. Not the authority of Aristotle, not the authority of the Church, not the authority of any traditional scripture. A foundation built on reason alone and what could be clearly and distinctly perceived by any rational mind. Regardless of culture, creed, or tradition, this was revolutionary. This was dangerous, and Descartes knew it. So he proceeded carefully, always professing his Catholic faith, always claiming that his philosophy supported rather than challenged religious truth. Whether he truly believed this, or whether it was protective camouflage, we'll never know for certain. What we do know is that he was giving humanity a new starting point. The individual thinking mind as the foundation of knowledge, not tradition, not authority, not revelation, but reason itself, and the journey to that foundation would require a kind of doubt, more radical than anyone had dared to undertake before. But here's what makes Descartes' project so deeply human, so profoundly moving. He wasn't just a cold rationalist playing intellectual games. He was a man searching for something to hold on to in a world of uncertainty. He was lonely. He had lost his mother as an infant. He never married, though he had a daughter, Francine, born to a servant woman, when Francine died of scarlet fever. At age 5, those who knew Descartes said he wept and called it the greatest sorrow of his life. This was a man who knew loss, who knew how fragile everything is, how quickly the things we love can disappear. And perhaps that's why he sought something permanent, something that couldn't be lost or destroyed, not in the external world, where everything changes and dies, but in the inner realm of thought itself. His greatest discovery would come not from exploring the world, but from exploring his own mind, not from looking outward, but from looking inward. And that discovery would begin with a simple but devastating question: can I trust my senses? We trust our senses completely. It's not something we think about. It's automatic. You see your hand in front of your face, and you don't question whether it's really there. You feel the chair supporting your weight, and you know it's solid. You hear these words, and you know they're entering your ears. Our entire life is built on this bedrock assumption. The senses tell us about reality, but do they? Descartes begins his first meditation by noting something we all know but rarely dwell upon. Our senses sometimes deceive us. Sometimes we see things that aren't there. Sometimes we mistake one thing for another. Sometimes reality is very different from how it appears. Think about the last time you saw a tower in the distance. From far away, it might have looked round, but when you approached it, you discovered it was square. The tower itself didn't change your perception of it, did? Your senses gave you false information. Or considered the way a straight stick appears bent when you place it halfway in water. The stick isn't bent, it's perfectly straight, but your visual perception tells you otherwise. The refraction of light deceives your eyes. These are simple examples, almost trivial, but they establish an important principle. If the senses can deceive us sometimes, How can we be absolutely certain they aren't deceiving us all the time? Now, you might object. Sure, senses can mislead us at a distance or in unusual circumstances. But when I'm looking at my own hand right in front of my face in good light, I can't be mistaken about that. That's as certain as knowledge gets. Descartes would have you slow down, not so fast. Let's think more carefully about what it means. For senses to deceive, consider phantom limb syndrome, something physicians even in Descartes' time were aware of, though they didn't understand it. People who have lost an arm or leg often report feeling sensations in the missing limb. They feel itching, pain, movement in a body part that no longer exists. The sensation is completely real to them. The pain is genuine pain. But the limb producing that pain isn't there. What does this tell us? It tells us that the sensation of having a limb and actually having a limb are two different things. You can have the sensation without the reality. The feeling is in your brain, not necessarily in the world. Modern neuroscience has confirmed this in stunning ways. We now know that all sensory experience is constructed by the brain. The redness you see isn't out there in the rosettes. A product of your visual cortex, interpreting wavelengths of light. The sweetness you taste isn't in the honey. It's your brain's interpretation of certain molecules, binding to receptors on your tongue. The world you experience is a simulation created by your brain based on sensory data, and sometimes that simulation diverges from reality. People with Charles Bonnet syndrome experienced vivid, detailed visual hallucinations when they're going blind. They might see children playing in their living room, or geometric patterns, or landscapes, all completely realistic, all completely false. Their brains, starved of visual input, are generating images on their own, or consider schizophrenia, where auditory hallucinations can be indistinguishable from real voices. The person hears someone speaking as clearly as you hear my voice now, but no one is there. The brain is generating the experience of sound without external sound waves. What's deeply unsettling about these cases isn't just that. Senses can dissipate, that the deception can be perfect. The hallucination can be completely indistinguishable from the inside, from genuine perception. If you're experiencing a vivid hallucination, you have no way of knowing it's a hallucination just by examining the experience itself. This means that sensory experience, by itself, can never guarantee truth. The experience of seeing something and the reality of that thing being there are two different matters. Now, you might still resist this. Sure, people with neurological conditions can have false perceptions, but I'm healthy. My brain is working normally, so I can trust my senses. But how do you know your brain is working normally? How do you know you're not one of the people with a condition? You know it, presumably, through your senses and through what other people tell you. But if your senses could be deceiving you, and if the people you're talking to might be hallucinations, do you see how the doubt begins to spread? Descartes pushes us to feel the full force of this uncertainty. If there's even the possibility that our senses are deceiving us, then we can't use sensory experience as an absolutely certain foundation for knowledge. We need something more secure. And yet, there's a part of us that wants to resist this. Because if we can't trust our senses, what can we trust? Our entire practical life depends on assuming our senses are generally reliable. We cross the street based on what we see and hear. We eat food based on how it looks and smells. We recognize our loved ones by their faces. To doubt all of this seems not just radical, but insane. Descartes knew this. He knew he was asking something almost impossible to genuinely doubt what seems most obvious. That's why his meditations are structured as exercises, as practices. He's not expecting you to read about doubt and immediately become a skeptic. He's asking you to try to doubt, to attempt to suspend your automatic trust in the senses, and to see what happens when you do. It's uncomfortable. It's destabilizing. That's the point, because only by pushing doubt to its limit do we discover what lies beyond doubt. The tower that looks round from a distance, the stick that looks bent in water, the phantom limb that isn't there, the hallucination that seems real. These aren't just curiosities. They're cracks in the edifice of sensory certainty. And Descartes is about to take a hammer to those cracks and bring the whole structure down. But he's not done yet. The doubt about senses is just the beginning, because there's a much more radical form of doubt still to come. A form of doubt so complete, so totalizing, that it threatens to swallow not just the external world, but our very selves. Before we go there, let's sit with this uncertainty for a moment. Look around you. Look at your hands, your surroundings, the play of light and shadow. Can you entertain, even for a moment, the possibility that all of it might be a construction of your mind? Not necessarily a false construction, but a construction nonetheless. A simulation running in your skull, based on data coming through sensory channels, but not identical to the external reality it represents. The philosopher Thomas Nagel once asked, "What is it like to be a bat?" Bats navigate by echolocation. Their experience of the world is built from sound bouncing off objects. What is that like? We literally cannot imagine it. Our consciousness is structured by our particular sensory organs and brain architecture. A bat's consciousness is structured differently. This means that the world, as we experience it, is always already species-specific, shaped by our particular biological equipment. ABC's ultraviolet patterns on flowers that we cannot see. A dog smells chemical signatures we cannot detect. Every organism lives in its own sensory universe. So when we say the real world, what do we mean? The world as it appears to us. But that's just the world as filtered through human sensory and cognitive systems. The world as it really is, independent of any observer. But we can never access that world directly. We can only access our species-specific, individual-specific perception of it. Descartes is leading us toward a profound realization. We are locked inside our own experience. We can never step outside of consciousness to compare our experience with reality as it is in itself. All we have is experience. All we can work with is what appears to our mind. This sounds like it might lead to complete skepticism if we can never access reality directly. How can we know anything about it? But Descartes has a different plan. He's going to show us that we don't need to access external reality to find certainty. We can find certainty right here in the realm of thought itself. But before we reach that conclusion, we need to go deeper into doubt. Much deeper. We need to consider the most radical skeptical hypothesis ever conceived. We need to ask, what if you're dreaming right now? As you listen to these words, you believe you're awake. You might be lying in bed, but you believe you're conscious, genuinely experiencing this moment, not dreaming. But how do you know? This is Descartes' second wave of doubt, and it's far more destabilizing than the mere unreliability of the senses. Because the dream argument doesn't just suggest that you might be perceiving things wrongly. It suggests that you might not be perceiving the external world at all. Think about your last vivid dream. Maybe you dreamed you were somewhere familiar. Childhood home, perhaps, or a place you visit often. In the dream, it felt completely real. You saw things, heard things, felt things. You had thoughts and emotions. You interacted with people and objects. And while you were dreaming, you had no doubt at all that it was real. Only when you woke up did you realize it had been a dream. Now here's the disturbing question. Right now, in this moment, how do you know you're not dreaming? You might say, dreams are vague and confused, while waking experience is clear and coherent. But is that really true? Haven't you had dreams that were perfectly clear and coherent while you were in them? Haven't you had dreams where you were convinced you were awake? Perhaps you've even had the experience of false awakening. You dream that you wake up, get out of bed, go through your morning routine, and then actually wake up and realize all of it was a dream. Some people report multiple layers of false awakening, waking up several times within a dream before finally waking up in reality. If you can dream that you're waking up, if you can dream that you're testing whether you're dreaming and concluding that you're awake, then how can you be certain this very moment isn't such a dream? The philosopher Zhuangzi, writing in ancient China around the same time as Aristotle in Greece, expressed this beautifully. He wrote, "Once upon a time, I dreamed I was a butterfly, fluttering here and there. I was conscious only of my happiness. As a butterfly, unaware that I was Zhuangzi. Soon I awakened, and there I was, veritably myself again. Now I do not know whether I was then a man dreaming I was a butterfly, or whether I am now a butterfly dreaming I am a man. This isn't just poetic fancy. It's a genuine philosophical problem. The experience of dreaming can be qualitatively identical to the experience of waking. From the inside, you can't always tell which state you're in. And if that's true, then all your sensory experiences, no matter how vivid, no matter how detailed, could be dream experiences. The entire world you perceive could be a fabrication of your sleeping mind. But wait, you might object. Dreams lack coherence. When I wake up, things don't make sense in the same way. Dreams have discontinuities, impossible events, bizarre juxtapositions. Waking life has continuity and consistency. True, usually, but not always. Some dreams have perfect internal coherence. And more importantly, how do you know that your waking life has continuity? Because you remember it. But you can have false memories in dreams. You can dream an entire backstory, a whole life history that feels completely real while you're dreaming it. And the real problem is this. If you're currently dreaming, then your memories of waking life, your memories of how coherent and consistent it is, are themselves part of the dream. A dream can include memories of waking life. It can include the experience of contrasting dream and waking states. It can include the thought, at least I'm awake now, unlike in that dream I had. Do you see how the doubt spirals inward? Every criterion you try to use to distinguish dreaming from waking is itself something that could be part of a dream. The philosopher Norman Malcolm pointed this out brilliantly. He noted that when we dream, we can dream that we're applying criteria to test whether we're dreaming. We can dream that we've pinched ourselves, or looked at a clock twice, or tried to read text, all the supposed tests for whether you're dreaming. And in the dream, these tests can seem to confirm we're awake. So the very act of trying to verify Your awake could itself be part of a dream. This is what makes the dream hypothesis so philosophically powerful. It's not just that you might be mistaken about some particular sensory perception. It's that the entire framework within which you're operating your sense of being in a real, physical world. Your memories, your reasoning processes, all of this could be occurring within a dream. Now, let's push this even further. How do you know that your entire life hasn't been a dream? What if you've never been awake at all? What if what you call waking life is just one long, consistent dream, and you've never experienced the state that's actually waking? You might say this is ridiculous, but on what grounds? You've never experienced anything outside your conscious experience. You have no external reference point to compare with. You've only ever been inside your own experience, whether dreaming or waking. The philosopher Bertrand Russell made a similar point with his 5-minute hypothesis. How do you know, he asked, that the entire universe didn't come into existence just 5 minutes ago, complete with false memories, fake fossils, and illusory light from distant stars? You can't disprove this hypothesis based on your memories, because the hypothesis includes those memories being false. Similarly, you can't disprove the hypothesis that you've been dreaming your entire life based on your memories of past waking moments, because the hypothesis includes those memories being part of the dream. This sounds paranoid, insane. And in a practical sense, it is. If we actually lived our lives believing we might be perpetually dreaming, we'd be paralyzed. We wouldn't cross streets, take medicine, care for children, or do anything that requires assuming our perception of reality is at least roughly accurate. Descartes knew this. He wasn't suggesting we actually adopt this skeptical stance in daily life. Remember his provisional moral code. He advocated living by the customs and laws of your country, acting decisively, managing your desires. He didn't walk around wondering if his dinner was a dream, but his project wasn't practical. It was epistemological. He was asking, what can I know with absolute certainty? And if there's even a possibility that I'm dreaming, then sensory experience can't provide that certainty. However, Descartes notices something important. Even if I'm dreaming, certain things must still be true. Even in a dream, 2 + 2 = 4. Even in a dream, a square has 4 sides. Even in a dream, logical and mathematical truths seem to hold. You can dream that you're flying, that you're talking to dead relatives, that you're in impossible places. But can you dream that 2 + 2 = 5 and have that be true within the dream? Can you dream that a circle is square and have that be coherent? It seems not. Mathematical and logical truths appear to transcend the distinction between dreaming and waking. They're necessary truths true in all possible worlds, including dream worlds. So maybe, Descartes thinks, even if we can't trust our senses about the physical world, we can at least trust mathematics and logic. Maybe there's a foundation there. But wait, can we be sure even of that? This is where Descartes introduces his most radical doubt. More radical than sensory illusion. More radical than the dream hypothesis. A doubt so extreme, so totalizing, that it threatens to undermine even mathematical truth. He asks, what if there's a powerful deceiver who's manipulating not just my sensory experience, but my very reasoning processes? What if even my most certain mathematical and logical intuitions are being fed to me by a malicious intelligence? Who wants to mislead me? What if, in other words, Everything I think I know, including the most basic truths of mathematics and logic, is a lie. And now, dear listener, we're about to meet one of the most famous thought experiments in philosophy. We're about to meet the evil demon. But before we do, take a moment to notice what's happened. We started with simple sensory errors that look round from a distance. We moved to the possibility that we might be dreaming right now. And now we're considering the possibility that even our most basic, rational faculties might be compromised. The doubt has been escalating. Each stage has been more radical than the last. And we're about to reach the culmination, the absolute limit of doubt. The question that will push us to the very edge of skepticism, to the point where it seems nothing can be known, nothing can be certain, nothing can be trusted. And it's precisely at that point, at the moment of absolute doubt, that Descartes will make his breakthrough. But we're not there yet. First, we have to descend into the abyss. We have to encounter the evil demon. We have to imagine a deceiver so powerful, so cunning, that even our clearest thoughts might be lies. Are you ready? Then let us meet this demon together. Let us see if anything can survive this ultimate test. Imagine a being of supreme power and intelligence. This being has access to your mind in ways you cannot resist or detect. This being can control what you see, what you hear, what you feel. More than that, this being can control what you think, what you believe, what seems obvious and certain to you. And this being has one goal: to deceive you, to make you believe what is false, to prevent you from knowing what is true. This is Descartes. Evil demonor, as he calls it, the malicious demon of the utmost power and cunning. In the original Latin of his Meditations, Descartes writes, "I will suppose, therefore, that some malicious demon of the utmost power and cunning has employed all his energies in order to deceive me. I shall think that the sky, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and all external things are merely the delusions of dreams which he has devised to ensnare my judgment. I shall consider myself as not having hands, or eyes, or flesh, or blood, or senses, but as falsely believing that I have all these things. This is a scenario more radical than dreaming. When you dream, you're still operating with your own mind, your own cognitive faculties. The dream is your own production, generated by your own brain following its own rules. But with the evil demon, even your cognitive faculties might be compromised. Even your clearest thoughts might be lies planted by this deceiver now. Why would Descartes introduce such an extreme, seemingly paranoid hypothesis? What's the point? The point is to push doubt to its absolute limit, to find what, if anything, remains certain even under the most extreme skeptical pressure. If something remains indubitable even when we imagine an all-powerful deceiver trying to trick us, then that thing is truly certain, not just practically certain, but philosophically certain. Certain with a capital C. Let's explore what the evil demon hypothesis implies. First, as Descartes makes clear, it means the entire physical world might not exist. The sky, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, all of it might be fabrications. You might not have a body. You might not have eyes, or ears, or hands. All the physical sensations you experience might be lies implanted by the demon. This goes beyond dreaming, because in a dream, presumably, there's still a body sleeping somewhere, a brain generating the dream. With the evil demon, there might be no body at all. You might be a disembodied mind being fed false experiences by this malicious intelligence. Second, other people might not exist. Your mother, your friends, your loved ones, they might all be illusions created by the demon. Every conversation you've ever had might have been with phantoms. You might be completely alone, the only real consciousness in a universe of lies. This is a profoundly isolating thought. The evil demon hypothesis takes the natural solipsism of consciousness, the fact that you can only directly experience your own mind, and weaponizes it. It asks, what if that solipsism is literal? What if you really are alone? Third, and most radically, even mathematical and logical truths might be false. Maybe 2 plus 2 doesn't actually equal 4. Maybe it seems to equal. For only because the demon makes it seem that way. Maybe when you add 2 plus 2, the demon manipulates your thinking so that 4 appears to be the answer, even though the real answer is something else. This is where the evil demon hypothesis becomes truly vertiginous. Because now we're not just doubting our senses, not just doubting the physical world. We're doubting reason itself. How can reason evaluate a hypothesis that suggests reason itself might be compromised? It's like asking someone who might be insane to evaluate whether they're insane. The very tools they'd use for the evaluation might be part of the problem. And yet Descartes notices something. Even here, even at this point of maximum doubt, even when we're supposing an all-powerful deceiver is manipulating our every thought, there's something that remains certain, but we'll get to that in a moment. First, let's understand why Descartes chose to frame this doubt in terms of an evil demon specifically. In Descartes' time and culture, the idea of malicious supernatural beings trying to deceive humans was familiar from Christian theology. Devils and demons were believed to tempt and mislead people. So framing the thought experiment this way would have resonated with his readers. But there was another resonator, more delicate one. Descartes could have posed the same hypothesis in terms of God. He could have asked, what if God is a deceiver? What if an omnipotent God is making me believe false things? But this would have been theologically problematic, even blasphemous. Descartes was careful to maintain that God, being perfect, cannot be a deceiver. Deception implies imperfection. So God is ruled out as a possible deceiver by definition. However, the logical force of the skeptical hypothesis doesn't depend on the deceiver being evil. It only depends on the deceiver being powerful enough to manipulate our minds. So Descartes frames it in terms of an evil demoner, being with great power but not divine perfection. This is actually a brilliant move, because it allows him to explore the most radical, skeptical hypothesis without seeming to impugn God's character. He's not saying God might be deceiving us. He's saying that for all we know, there could be a non-divine but powerful entity deceiving us. And until we can rule that out, we can't be certain of anything the potential deceiver might be manipulating. Now, here's something interesting that philosophers have debated. Is the evil demon hypothesis actually coherent? Can we really imagine a being so powerful that it makes 2 plus 2 seem 2 equal 4 when it actually equals something else? Some philosophers say no. Logical and mathematical truths aren't just things that seem true, they're necessarily true. They're true by definition, true in all possible worlds. There's no possible world where 224, because what we mean by 2, 4, addition, and equals makes it necessarily true that 2, 2 equals 4. If that's right, then even an omnipotent demon couldn't make 2 = 5. Because that's not just false, but logically impossibly making a square circle. Other philosophers have countered. Maybe we're being too confident about what's logically necessary. Maybe our intuitions about logical necessity are themselves potentially compromised by the demon. Maybe the demon is making us think that 2 = 4 is necessarily true when it's actually contingent. This debate gets us into deep waters. But for Descartes' purposes, what matters is the psychological effect of the evil demon hypothesis. It's meant to make us feel the full force of radical doubt. It's meant to shake us loose from our comfortable certainties. And in his day, for his first readers, it was shocking. Descartes was accused of atheism for even entertaining such a hypothesis. How dare he suggest that all our beliefs, including mathematical truths, might be false? Wasn't this a path to complete skepticism and nihilism? But Descartes had an answer waiting. The evil demon hypothesis, as extreme as it is, actually leads to an indubitable truth. Because even if the demon is deceiving me about everything, even if all my beliefs are false, even if my reasoning is compromised, there's one thing the demon cannot deceive me about: my own existence. Think about it. For the demon to deceive me, there must be a me to be deceived. If I'm being tricked, I must exist to be the victim of the trick. The act of deception presupposes a deceived mind. So even if an all-powerful evil demon is controlling all my thoughts, making me believe falsehoods, manipulating my reasoning, there's still one thing that must be true. I exist. The demon can make me doubt everything else. But the one thing the demon cannot do is make me doubt my own existence while I'm thinking. Because the very act of doubting requires a doubter. This is the breakthrough. This is the unshakable foundation Descartes has been searching for. It's not in the external world. It's not in sensory experience. It's not even in mathematical reasoning. It's in existence itself, in the sheer fact of consciousness. But before we explore that breakthrough fully, let's pause and consider what Descartes has accomplished with the evil demon hypothesis. He's taken us to the absolute limit of doubt. He's shown us that literally everything we believe could be false X for one thing. And that one thing is enough. That one thing is the foundation on which everything else can be rebuilt. The evil demon, this terrifying thought experiment, this nightmare of total deception, has paradoxically led us to certainty. By doubting everything, we've found something that cannot be doubted, and that something is you. Or more precisely, the thinking, doubting, wondering I that exists in this very moment of doubt. This is the cogito. This is I think, therefore I am. And we're about to explore what might be the most famous argument in the history of philosophy. After all the doubt, after all the questioning, after pushing skepticism to its absolute limit, Descartes arrives at something that cannot be doubted. Listen to how he describes it in the second meditation. I have convinced myself that there is absolutely nothing in the world, no sky, no earth, no minds, no bodies. Does it now follow that I too do not exist? No, if I convinced myself of something, then I certainly existed. It's almost childishly simple. So simple that it's easy to miss how profound it is. If I'm doubting, I must exist. If I'm thinking, I must exist. If I'm being deceived, I must exist. Because all these activities, doubting, thinking, being deceived, require a subject who does them. There can't be doubt without a doubter. There can't be thought without a thinker. There can't be deception without someone being deceived. Descartes continues. But there is a deceiver of supreme power and cunning who is deliberately and constantly deceiving me. In that case, I too undoubtedly exist if he is deceiving me. And let him deceive me as much as he can. He will never bring it about that I am nothing so long as I think that I am something. Do you see the logic here? The more the demon tries to deceive me, the more certain my existence becomes. Because deception requires a target. The demon can lie to me about everything, about the external world, about other people, about mathematical truths, but the demon cannot lie to me about my own existence. Because the very act of lying to me confirms that I exist to be lied to. This is what philosophers call a performative contradiction. Trying to doubt your own existence while you're doubting performs a contradiction. The doubt itself confirms what you're trying to doubt. It's like saying, I don't exist. The statement is self-refuting. Who's making the statement? If you don't exist, you can't make the statement. If you do make the statement, you must exist, so the statement is false. Similarly, I'm not thinking is self-refuting when thought. The thinking of the thought contradicts its content. Descartes saw that existence and thought are bound together in a unique way. Not existence in general. He hasn't proven yet that bodies exist, or that the physical world exists, but the existence of a thinking thing. The existence of the I that thinks. In later writing, Descartes would formulate this as cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. These four Latin words, three in the French version, j'y pense, donc j'y suis, became perhaps the most famous phrase in modern philosophy, but it's important to understand what the cogito is and isn't. It's not a logical syllogism in the traditional sense. It's not all things that think exist. I think, therefore I exist. That would be a deductive argument, and it would depend on the truth of the major premise, which could itself be doubted. Rather, the cogito is what philosophers call an immediate intuition. It's something you grasp directly, not by reasoning from premises to conclusion, but by attending to your own experience. In the very act of thinking, you become aware that you exist. Try it yourself. Right now, as you listen to these words, as thoughts form in your mind, can you doubt that there's a mind in which those thoughts are forming? Can you doubt that thinking is occurring? You might doubt whether your thoughts are true. You might doubt whether they correspond to external reality. But can you doubt that the thinking itself is happening? It seems not. The attempt to doubt thinking is itself thinking. You can't get outside of thought to question whether thought exists. This is what makes the cogito unique among truths. It's self-verifying in a way that other truths aren't. The truth 2 + 2 = 4 doesn't verify itself. You have to do some mathematical reasoning to confirm it. The truth I have a body doesn't verify itself. Few have to check your sensory experience. But I exist verifies itself in the very act of thinking it. You can't think I exist without that thought being true. Every time you think it, every time you grasp it, it's confirmed. Or, as Descartes puts it, this proposition, I am, I exist, is necessarily true whenever it is put forward by me or conceived in my mind. Notice the qualification whenever it is put forward by me or conceived in my mind. The cogito isn't claiming that I exist eternally or necessarily in some absolute sense. It's claiming that at any moment when I'm thinking, at that moment I must exist. If I stop thinking, if I fall into dreamless sleep, or if consciousness ceases, then, for all I know, I might stop existing. The cogito doesn't rule that out. It only establishes that I exist at any moment when I'm aware of thinking. This is both the power and the limitation of the cogito. It gives me certainty about my existence in the present moment of thought. But it doesn't tell me anything about what kind of thing I am, whether I exist when I'm not thinking, or whether anything else exists. Which brings us to an important question. What is this I that exists? Descartes has just established that he exists as a thinking thing. But what does that mean? Is he a body that thinks? A soul inhabiting a body? Something else entirely? This is where Descartes makes a crucial move. He asks, what can I be certain about regarding what I am? Can I be certain I have a body? No, the evil demon might be deceiving me about that. I might not have a body at all. Can I be certain I'm in a physical world? No, the demon might be fabricating that too. Can I be certain I have sensory organs, a brain, physical presence? No, no, and no. But I can be certain I'm thinking. The very act of doubting confirms thought. And if I'm thinking, then I must be a thing that thinks. A thinking thing. A mind. Now. Descartes is very careful here. He's not yet claiming that he's only a mind, or that he doesn't have a body. He's just claiming that he can be certain he's a mind, while he can't yet be certain he's a body, as he puts it. I am, I exist, that is certain. But for how long? For as long as I am thinking. For it could be that were I totally to cease from thinking, I should totally cease to exist. At present I am not admitting anything except what is necessarily true. I am, then, in the strict sense, only a thing that thinks. That phrase in the strict sense is important. It means setting aside everything I can't be certain about. All I can be certain I am is a thinking thing. Later, Descartes will try to prove that the mind is not just distinguishable from the body, but actually separate that they're two different substances. But that argument comes later. For now, at this stage of the meditations, he's just established the bare minimum. I am a thinking thing. But what's included in thinking? Descartes has a broad conception. Thinking includes doubting, understanding, affirming, denying, willing, refusing, imagining, and sensing. All mental activities, all operations of consciousness, count as thinking in his broad sense. So when he says, I think, therefore I am, he doesn't just mean I'm engaging in abstract rational thought. He means I'm conscious in any way at all. If you're doubting, you exist. If you're feeling, you exist. If you're imagining, you exist. If you're experiencing anything at all, you exist as the subject of that experience. This is actually a very profound insight. Consciousness itself, in all its forms, is self-verifying. The having of any experience whatsoever confirms that theirs. And experts and philosophers call this the Cartesian cogito, and it's been endlessly debated. Some philosophers accept it as genuinely indubitable. Others have raised objections. One famous objection, raised by the philosopher Georg Lichtenberg, is that Descartes should only say there is thinking or thinking is occurring, not I think. Because to say I think already assumes an I. a self, which is exactly what needs to be proven. Maybe Lichtenberg suggests. There's just thought happening, without any need for a thinker. Like how we say, it's raining, without implying there's an it that performs the action of raining. This is a subtle point. Is Descartes smuggling in the concept of a persistent self, when all he's really entitled to claim is that thoughts are occurring? Descartes would probably respond, the I isn't being smuggled in, it's given directly in the experience of thinking. When I think, I'm immediately aware not just of thoughts, but of myself as the thinker. The self is not an inference from thought, but part of the very structure of thought. When you think, you don't just experience abstract thoughts floating by. You experience yourself thinking. There's a subject quality to conscious experience that can't be eliminated. But Lichtenberg's objection points to a genuine puzzle. What is the self? Is it a substantial thing, an entity that has thoughts? Or is it just a stream of thoughts somehow organized together? This question would become central in later philosophy. David Hume would argue that when he introspects, he finds only particular thoughts and feelings, never a self that has them. The self, Hume claimed, is just a bundle of perceptions, not a substantial thing. Buddhism had arrived at a similar conclusion centuries earlier. There is no permanent, unchanging self. There are only momentary experiences arising and passing away. But Descartes is convinced there must be a self, a subject, an I, and the cogito is his proof. Thought requires a thinker. Experience requires an experiencer. Consciousness requires a conscious being. Whether he's right about this remains debated. But what's undeniable is the power of the cogito as a philosophical move. By turning inward, by focusing on consciousness itself, rather than on external objects, Descartes established a new starting point for philosophy. Prior to Descartes, philosophy generally started from the world, from things that exist outside the mind, from nature, from God, from objective reality. Descartes reverses this. He starts from the mind, from consciousness, from subjective experience. And only then, from that foundation, does he try to work outward to the world. This is what philosophers call the subjective turn in modern philosophy. And it's Descartes' great innovation. For better or worse, Western philosophy after Descartes became increasingly concerned with the problem of how a mind can know anything beyond itself. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, at this moment in the meditations, Descartes has established one thing. I exist as a thinking thing. It's not much. It's the bare minimum. But it's something. It's solid ground in a sea of doubt. And from this tiny island of certainty, Descartes will begin to rebuild. He'll try to prove that God exists. He'll try to prove that the external world exists. He'll try to show that reason can be trusted and that we can have genuine knowledge. Whether he succeeds in all this is another matter. But the fact that he found a foundation at all after such radical doubt is remarkable. Out of absolute skepticism, he pulled a certainty. Out of the abyss, he found solid ground. Not in the heavens, not in nature, not in mathematics, but in the simple fact of consciousness itself. I think, therefore I am, for words that changed philosophy forever. But before Descartes can build outward from this foundation, he needs to examine more carefully what this thinking thing is. He needs to understand the nature of mind itself, and to do that, he's going to perform one of the most famous thought experiments in philosophy, an experiment involving a piece of wax. Descartes has established that he exists as a thinking thing, but he wants to understand more clearly what it means to be a mind, and how mind relates to body and to the material world. To explore this, he picks up a piece of wax, fresh from the honeycomb, and he examines it carefully. The wax has certain sensory qualities. It has a particular color, perhaps yellowish or golden. It has a particular texture, smooth. It has a particular smeller, sweet honey smell. It has a particular shape, maybe irregular, chunk-like. When he taps it, it makes a certain sound. It has a particular taste, if he were to taste it. So the wax, as he experiences it, is a bundle of sensory qualities, visual appearance, texture, smell, shape, sound, taste. Now Descartes does something simple but profound. He brings the wax near a flame, and it melts. What happens? All the sensory qualities change. The color changes as the wax becomes translucent. The texture changes. From solid to liquid, the honey smell diminishes or disappears. The shape changes completely as the wax flows. The sound it makes when tapped changes. The taste would change to dot. Every single sensory property has transformed. And yet, Descartes notes, we still recognize it as the same piece of wax. This is striking. If we identified the wax with its sensory properties, we'd have to say it's no longer the same thing. It's become something else. But we don't say that. We say the wax has changed, which means it's the same wax that has undergone change. So what is the wax really? What persists through all these sensory changes? It can't be the color that changed. It can't be the texture that changed. It can't be the shape that changed too. It can't be any of the sensory qualities, because all of them changed. Descartes concludes that what we grasp when we think of the wax isn't any particular sensory quality or bundle of sensory qualities. It's something more abstract, extension in space, the capacity to take on different shapes, flexibility, malleability. The wax is essentially extended stuff that occupies space and can be modified in various ways. The specific sensory qualities are accidents, properties it happens to have at this moment, but could be different. The essence is extension itself. And crucially, Descartes says, this essence isn't grasped by the senses, it's grasped by the mind, by the intellect, by understanding. When I see the melted wax and recognize it as the same wax, I'm not just responding to sensory input. I'm understanding something about the nature of material substance that goes beyond what my senses directly tell me. The senses only give me the surface, the particular colors, shapes, textures at this moment. The mind grasps the underlying nature of the extended substance that can take on various colors, shapes, and textures. This is a crucial move in Descartes' philosophy. He's showing that even our knowledge of material objects depends on the mind, not just the senses. The senses provide raw data, but the mind interprets that data, organizing it into our experience of persistent objects in space. Think about how you perceive a table. As you move around it, the sensory input is constantly changing, different angles, different lighting, different shadows, and yet you perceive one table remaining constant through all these changes. How? Because your mind unifies all these varying sensory inputs into the concept of one extended object occupying space. The tableness isn't just in the sensations. It's in how your mind organizes and interprets those sensations. Descartes is making a point that would be central to later philosophy. Perception isn't passive reception of sensory data. It's active interpretation by the mind. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant would take this insight further a century later. Kant argued that the mind doesn't just passively receive experience, actively structures experience according to built-in categories like space, time, causality, and substance. We can't experience things except as extended in space and persisting through time, because space and time are the forms through which our minds organize experience. But we're getting ahead again. For Descartes, the wax example establishes something important. The intellect, not the senses, is our primary way of knowing even material objects. And if that's true for knowledge of material things, how much more true is it for knowledge of immaterial things, like the mind itself? Descartes writes, "I now know that even bodies are not strictly perceived by the senses or the faculty of imagination, but by the intellect alone, and that this perception derives not from their being touched or seen, but from their being understood." This flips our usual assumption. We tend to think we know material things best through our senses, while abstract concepts are harder to grasp. But Descartes is saying the opposite. We know material things through intellectual understanding, just like we know abstract concepts. The senses are actually the less reliable, less clear mode of knowledge. And when it comes to the mind itself, we have even more direct knowledge. Because when I think about my own thinking, when I'm conscious of my own consciousness, there's no sensory intermediary at all. It's pure intellectual self-awareness. I know my body through senses, which might deceive, but I know my mind directly through immediate awareness. Every time I think, I'm directly aware that I'm thinking. Every time I doubt, I'm directly aware that I'm doubting. So Descartes concludes that he knows his own mind more clearly and certainly than he knows any material object, including his own body. This might seem counterintuitive. Don't I know my hand more certainly than I know my thoughts? I can see my hand, touch it, feel it moving. But Descartes would say, all that sensory experience of your hand is actually mental. The seeing, touching, feeling, those are all mental events. You have direct access to those mental events. But the hand itself, that's something you infer exists based on sensory experience, which might be misleading. So the structure of knowledge for Descartes looks like this. I know with absolute certainty that I exist as a thinking thing. I know with clarity the contents of my own consciousness, my thoughts, feelings, perceptions, and I infer with less certainty the existence of external objects that might be causing some of those perceptions. The wax argument reinforces this structure. Even when I seem to be knowing an external object, the wax, what I'm really doing is using my intellect to understand the concept of extended substance. And I'm having sensory experiences that I interpret as being caused by such substance. But do extended substances really exist? Does the physical world really exist? Or could all of this be the fabrication of an evil demon? Descartes hasn't answered that yet. To answer it, he's going to need to prove something else first. Something that might seem like an odd detour from epistemology into theology. He's going to need to prove that God exists. And not just any God, but a specific kind of God. A God who is perfect, who cannot be a deceiver, who guarantees that our clear and distinct perceptions correspond to reality, without proving God's existence. Descartes is stuck. He knows his own mind exists, but he has no way to get from that knowledge to knowledge of an external world. The evil demon might still be deceiving him about everything beyond his own thoughts. So the next stage of the meditations is devoted to proofs for God's existence. 3 different arguments, each trying to show that a perfect being must exist, and that this perfect being's existence guarantees we can trust our rational faculties. Whether these arguments work is hotly debated, but they're crucial to Descartes' project, because without God, he's trapped in solipsism, locked inside his own mind with no way to know whether anything else exists. Let's see how he tries to escape that trap. Descartes is in a predicament. He knows he exists as a thinking thing, but he doesn't yet know whether anything else exists. The physical world might be an illusion. Other people might not exist. Even mathematical truths might be tricks of an evil demon to escape this skeptical trap. Descartes needs to prove that there's a benevolent God who wouldn't allow him to be systematically deceived. If he can establish that God exists and is good, then he can trust that his clear and distinct perceptions correspond to reality. But how do you prove God exists when you're starting from radical doubt, when you've suspended trust in everything, except your own existence as a thinking thing? Descartes offers 3 different arguments. Let's examine each one. The first argument, from the idea of God, Descartes begins by examining his thoughts. He has various ideas in his mind, ideas of physical objects, ideas of animals, ideas of other people, and among them, an idea of God. Now, where did these ideas come from? Some ideas might come from sensory experience. My idea of a tree, probably, originated from seeing trees. Other ideas might come from my imagination. I can combine the idea of a horse and the idea of a horn to create the idea of a unicorn, even though I've never seen a unicorn. But what about my idea of God? This is the idea of a being that is infinite, eternal, unchangeable, independent, all-knowing, all-powerful, perfect in every way. Descartes asks, could this idea have come from my sensory experience? No, I've never experienced anything infinite or perfect through my senses. Everything I've sensed is finite and imperfect. Could it have come from my imagination? Could I have constructed it by taking some finite qualities and amplifying them, or by negating imperfections? Descartes says no, and here's why. There's a principle he accepts, following medieval philosophy, that a cause must have at least as much reality as its effect. Something more perfect can produce something less perfect, but something less perfect cannot produce something more perfect. I am finite and imperfect. I doubt, which means I lack knowledge. I change, which means I'm not eternal. I'm dependent on circumstances, not independent. So how could I, a finite and imperfect being, produce the idea of an infinite and perfect being? Where would such an idea come from? It can't come from nothing. Ideas don't just appear from nowhere. It can't come from other finite things. They're all imperfect too. It must come from an actually infinite and perfect being. It must come from God himself. The idea of God in my mind is like a trademark or signature. Just as a master craftsman might sign his work, God has placed his signature in my consciousness. The innate idea of infinite perfection. This is sometimes called the trademark argument. My idea of God is proof of God's existence, because only God could have caused such an idea to exist in my mind. Now, you might object. I can have an idea of a perfect island without perfect islands existing. So why can't I have an idea of a perfect being without perfect beings existing? Descartes would respond that perfection in islands is just a human evaluation we're taking qualities, like beaches and palm trees, and saying more is better. But there's no objective standard of island perfection. Different people might disagree about what makes an island perfect, but God's perfection isn't like that. It's not a matter of having more of some qualities we value. It's a matter of having all positive qualities to an infinite degree and lacking all limitations. That's a very specific concept, and Descartes claims it couldn't arise in a finite mind unless placed there by an infinite being. Whether this argument works is debatable. Many philosophers, even some sympathetic to Descartes, think it's the weakest of his three arguments. But let's move to the second one. The second argument. From my existence as an imperfect being, this argument starts from the fact that I exist, but I'm imperfect. I doubt, I make mistakes, I'm limited in power and knowledge. If I had created myself, wouldn't I have made myself perfect? If I had the power to bring myself into existence, surely I'd have the power to give myself all the perfections I can conceive of, but I didn't create myself, so something else must have created me. What? Could my parents have created me? They created my body, but did they create my mind, my consciousness, my capacity for thought? And even if they created my mind, how did they get that power? They're imperfect beings too. We can trace back a chain of cause as my parents, their parents, and so on, but this chain must eventually terminate in something that exists necessarily, not contingently. Otherwise, we'd have an infinite regress of imperfect beings, each depending on previous imperfect beings, with no ultimate explanation for why there's anything at all. So there must be a first cause, an ultimate source that doesn't depend on anything else. And this source must be perfect, must have all perfections be, because otherwise we haven't really explained why imperfect beings exist. Furthermore, whatever created me must currently be sustaining me in existence. Existence isn't just a matter of being initially created and then persisting automatically. Each moment I could cease to exist. The fact that I continue to exist requires an ongoing cause. Think of it like light from a lamp. The lamp doesn't just create light once and then the light continues on its own. The lamp must continuously emit light for the light to persist. Similarly, God must continuously sustain me in existence. This is a more metaphysical, less intuitive version of the cosmological argument for God's existence. It depends on accepting some controversial premises, like the idea that existence requires continuous causation, and that an infinite regress of causes is impossible. Medieval philosophers like Thomas Aquinas had developed sophisticated versions of such arguments. Descartes is adapting them to his epistemological project. The third argument, the ontological argument. This is Descartes' most famous and most controversial argument. It's a version of an argument originally developed by Saint Anselm in the 11th Century. Descartes starts with a definition of God, a being that possesses all perfections. Now, is existence a perfection? Descartes says yes. It's better to exist than not to exist. Existence is a positive quality, while non-existence is a lack or privation. But if God by definition possesses all perfections, and existence is a perfection, then God must possess existence. Just as a triangle by definition must have three sides, God by definition must exist. Put differently, it's part of the essence of God to exist. Just as you can't have a triangle without three sides, you can't have God without existence. This might sound like wordplay. Surely you can't prove something exists just by defining it a certain way. But Descartes thinks this case is special. With most things, essence and existence are separate. We can define what a unicorn is, a horse with a horn, without that definition telling us whether unicorns actually exist. We have to go out and investigate the world to find out. But with God, essence and existence are bound together, because God is defined as the maximally perfect being, and existence is of perfection. God must exist. To see why Descartes thinks this, consider what would follow if God didn't exist. Then, there would be a possible being more perfect than the being we're calling God, namely, a being with all the same qualities plus existence. But that contradicts the definition of God as the maximally perfect being. So necessarily, if we understand what God means, we must understand that God exists. This argument has been endlessly debated. The philosopher Immanuel Kant famously objected that existence is not a property or perfection. To say something exists doesn't add to its concept. It just says that the concept is instantiated in reality. Saying God is omnipotent, omniscient, and existent isn't like saying God is omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent. Benevolence is a property that adds to our understanding of God's nature. But existence doesn't add to the nature. It just says that such a nature is real rather than merely conceptual. If Kant is right, then the ontological argument fails because it treats existence as a perfection when it's actually not the right kind of thing. But other philosophers have defended versions of the ontological argument, claiming that necessary existence might be a property, even if contingent existence isn't. For our purposes, the important thing is why Descartes needs these arguments. He needs to establish that God exists and is perfect in order to rule out the evil demon hypothesis. If God exists and is perfect, then God is not a deceiver. A perfect being would not systematically deceive his creatures. Deception involves either malicious or incompetent or both. So if God exists and created me, God wouldn't have given me cognitive faculties that systematically mislead me about reality. When I perceive something clearly and distinctly, when I reason carefully, I can trust that I'm reaching truth, because God wouldn't allow my properly functioning faculties to deceive me. This is the key move. God's existence and perfection serve as the foundation for trusting reason. They're the bridge from I exist as a thinking thing to I can know truths about reality beyond my own mind. But here's where Descartes runs into a famous problem. A problem so significant it has its own name in philosophy. The Cartesian circle. The problem is this. Descartes uses clear and distinct perception, rational intuition to prove that God exists. But he needs God to exist in order to guarantee that clear and distinct perception is reliable. Isn't this circular? He's using reason to prove God exists, then using God's existence to validate reason. He's assuming what he's trying to prove. Descartes was aware of this objection and tried to answer it. His response, roughly, is that some truths are so self-evident that even without God's guarantee, we can grasp them in the moment we attend to them clearly. The cogito is like this. When I'm actually thinking I exist, I can't doubt it. Similarly, when I'm actually working through a mathematical proof, when I'm seeing the logical connections directly, I can't doubt them in that moment. The problem isn't that clear and distinct. Perceptions might be false while we're having them. It's that we might doubt them later when we're no longer attending to them directly. Memory might be fallible. The evil demon might have manipulated our past reasoning. So what God's existence guarantees isn't the momentary indubitability of clear and distinct perceptions that's already given. What it guarantees is that we can trust those perceptions after the fact, can build a body of knowledge from them, can rely on them in reasoning even when we're not currently intuiting them directly. Whether this response saves Descartes from the charge of circularity is debated. Many philosophers think the circle is real and undermines his project. Others think he successfully avoids it. But let's step back from technical philosophical debates and ask, what has Descartes accomplished with these arguments? He's tried to show that the universe has a rational structure, that there's an intelligent author who has designed our minds to track truth when used properly. This means we're not ultimately alone in a hostile or indifferent universe. There's a benevolent creator who wants us to know truth. This is deeply reassuring, if it's true. It means the method of doubt, pushed to its extreme, doesn't end in nihilistic skepticism. It ends in knowledge, grounded in divine assurance. Whether the arguments succeed in proving what Descartes wants them to prove is one thing. Whether they're philosophically satisfying is another. Many philosophers, even theistic ones, have felt that proving God's existence from the isolated standpoint of the thinking subject is an impossible task. But Descartes had to try. His entire epistemological project depended on it. Without God, he's stuck in solipsism. With God, he can rebuild knowledge of the external world. And with God established, Descartes can now tackle the question he's been building toward from the beginning. What is the relationship between mind and body? How does consciousness relate to physical matter? This question would become one of the most enduring problems in philosophy. It's still debated today, centuries later. And Descartes' answer mind and body are two completely different substances would dominate philosophical discussion for generations. Let's see what he says. Descartes has established that he exists as a thinking thing, a mind. He's also proven to his own satisfaction that God exists and guarantees the reliability of clear and distinct perceptions. This means he can now trust that there's a real physical world corresponding to his sensory experiences. But this raises a profound question. How do mind and body relate to each other? What is the connection between consciousness and matter? Descartes' answer is what philosophers call substance dualism. Mind and body, he argues, are two completely different kinds of substance, with completely different essential properties. What's a substance? In philosophical terminology, a substance is something that can exist independently, not needing anything else to exist. It's a thing in itself, not a property of something else. Descartes claims there are two created substances: mental substance, res cogitans, thinking thing, and physical substance, res extensa, extended thing, plus one, uncreated substance. God, mental substance, has one essential property, thought. Physical substance has one essential property, extension, taking up space, having dimensions. These properties are completely different in kind. Thought is non-spatial. It doesn't make sense to ask how many inches wide a thought is, or where. In physical space an idea is located. Extension is non-mental. Physical objects don't think or feel, because the essential properties are different. The substances themselves must be different. Mind is not body. Body is not mind. They're fundamentally distinct kinds of being. How did Descartes arrive at this conclusion? He uses what's called the argument from clear and distinct perception. He can clearly and distinctly conceive of his mind existing without his body. He can imagine being a pure consciousness with no physical form. The Cogito had already shown him this was at least epistemically possible. He could doubt his body's existence, while being certain of his mind's existence. Conversely, he can conceive of his body existing without consciousness. He can imagine being in a coma, or being dead, with his body continuing to exist as a physical object that no longer thinks or feels. Because he can clearly and distinctly conceive mind without body and body without mind, and because God guarantees that what we clearly and distinctly perceive is at least possible, it follows that mind and body can exist separately. They're not essentially bound together, and if they can exist separately, they must be different substances, because if something is part of the essence of X, then X can't exist without it. Since mind can exist without body, body is not part of mind's essence. Since body can exist without mind, mind is not part of body's essence. Therefore, mind and body are distinct substances. This has a profound implication. The soul or mind, Descartes uses the terms interchangeably, is immortal. It can survive the death of the body. When your body dies and decomposes, your consciousness' sure, essential self could continue to exist. This was theologically attractive. It aligned with Christian doctrine about the soul's immortality. But Descartes claimed he was arriving at it through philosophical reasoning, not religious faith. Now, if mind and body are so completely different, how do they interact? How does my mental decision to raise my arm cause my physical arm to move? How does physical damage to my body cause mental sensations of pain? This is the famous mind-body problem, and it's the great challenge to Cartesian dualism. Descartes was aware of the problem, and his answer has been widely regarded as unsatisfactory. He suggested that mind and body interact in the pineal gland, a small organ in the center of the brain. He chose the pineal gland because it's single, not duplicated in both hemispheres like most brain structures, and seemed to him to be the seat where sensory information comes together. In the pineal gland, Descartes thought, mental and physical causations somehow meet. Mental intentions cause physical movements, and physical stimuli cause mental sensations. But this doesn't really solve the problem. It just relocates it. How does the immaterial mind cause anything to happen in the physical? Pineal gland. How does interaction occur between two substances with completely different natures? One of Descartes' most astute critics was Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, with whom he had an extensive philosophical correspondence. Elizabeth pressed him on exactly this point. If mind has no extension, if it doesn't exist in space, how can it move a body that does exist in space? How can something with no physical properties exert physical force? Descartes' response was essentially to say that the interaction is simply given in our experience. We directly experience making bodily movements with our mind and feeling bodily. Sensations in our mind, we shouldn't doubt this direct experience. Just because we can't explain the mechanism, but this wasn't very satisfying to Elizabeth or to later philosophers. If mind and body are as radically different as Descartes claims, their interaction seems impossible or at least deeply mysterious. This problem generated a huge amount of philosophical discussion. Some philosophers proposed solutions, occasionalism, developed by Nicolas Malebranche, suggested that mind and body don't actually interact directly. Instead, God acts as intermediary. When you will to raise your arm, God causes your arm to move. When your body is damaged, God causes you to feel pain. Every apparent interaction is actually an occasion for God to coordinate the mental and physical realms. This preserves dualism, but at the cost of making God do an enormous amount of constant micromanaging of the universe. Pre-established harmony, developed by Gottfried Leibniz, suggested that mind and body don't interact at all. Instead, God created them in perfect synchronization from the beginning. It's like two clocks showing the same time, not because one causes the other, but because they were both wound and set correctly initially. Your mental life and your bodily life unfold in parallel, perfectly coordinated, without actually influencing each other. This is elegant, but strange. It means your decision to raise your arm doesn't actually cause your arm to move. Your arm was going to move anyway, and your decision happens to coincide with it. Monism rejects dualism entirely, claiming there's only one kind of substance. Baruch Spinoza, another 17th century philosopher, argued that mind and body are two aspects or attributes of one underlying substance which he identified with God or nature. They're not separate things, but different ways of conceiving the same reality. Alternatively, materialist monism says only matter exists, and mind is somehow reducible to or emerges from physical processes. This became increasingly popular with advances in neuroscience, showing tight correlations between brain states and mental states. Or idealist monism says only mind exists, and matter is somehow reducible to mental phenomena. This seems counterintuitive, but has had distinguished defenders, including Bishop George Berkeley. All of these positions are attempts to solve or dissolve the mind-body problem that Descartes bequeathed to philosophy. The problem remains unsolved today. It's morphed into what philosopher David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness. How and why do physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience? We know that certain brain states correlate with certain experiences. Stimulate this part of the brain, and the person sees colors. Damage that part, and they lose the ability to recognize faces. Alter brain chemistry, and consciousness changes. But correlation isn't explanation. Why do particular neural patterns feel like something? Why is there a subjective, qualitative character to experience? When you see red, when you feel pain, when you taste chocolate, there's something it's like to have these experiences. They have qualitative character, what philosophers call qualia. How do you get from neurons firing which we can observe and measure to the subjective experience of redness which we can't observe from the outside? This is Descartes' mind-body problem in modern dress. And despite centuries of philosophical and scientific work, it remains deeply puzzling. Some contemporary Philosophers and neuroscientists are confident that future brain science will explain consciousness in purely physical terms. Others think consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe, not reducible to anything else. Others still think the problem is, in some sense, unsolvable. Subjective experience and objective description are incommensurable, but the problem itself, how mind, relates to Baudillard's Descartes legacy by drawing such a sharp distinction between mental and physical, by making consciousness and matter into two completely different kinds of thing. He created a puzzle that philosophy is still trying to solve. Was he right to draw this distinction? Or did he take a wrong turn that philosophy should backtrack from? Different philosophers give different answers, but most agree that even if Descartes was wrong about dualism, his clear formulation of the problem was philosophically valuable. It forced us to think carefully about what consciousness is, how it relates to the physical world, and whether there's something irreducibly subjective about experience that can't be captured in objective, scientific terms and in his own life. Descartes didn't just theorize about mind and body. He experienced their intimate connection. He suffered from various illnesses. His daughter died young, causing him profound grief and experience that must have made the mind-body problem intensely personal. Later in his career, he wrote about the emotions, about how mental states and bodily states influence each other, even if we can't fully explain the mechanism. This work, The Passions of the Soul, was more practical and less purely theoretical. Let's turn to that now, to Descartes' reflections on how we actually live as embodied minds, even if we don't understand the metaphysical details of how mind and body connect. In 1649, near the end of his life, Descartes published The Passions of the Soul. This work represents a shift from the pure epistemology and metaphysics of the Meditations to questions about human nature, emotion, and how to live well, despite his dualism. Despite insisting that mind and body are distinct substances, Descartes recognized that in human life they're intimately united. We're not angels' pure minds temporarily imprisoned in bodies. We're embodied minds, unified beings who experience ourselves as both mental and physical. When I'm hungry, I don't just observe my body needs food in a detached way. I feel the hunger. When I'm frightened, my heart races, my palms sweat. The emotion is both mental and physical. When I'm in love, it's not just a thought. It's a feeling that involves my whole being. Descartes calls these experiences passions, using the term broadly to mean emotions, feelings, appetites. They arise from the interaction of mind and body, even though we can't fully explain how that interaction works. In The Passions of the Soul, Descartes tries to describe and categorize these passions and to offer guidance on how to manage them. He identifies 6 primitive passions from which all others derive: wonder, love, hate, desire, joy, and sadness. Wonder is the first and most basic, the surprised attention we give to something novel or striking. It's neither pleasant nor unpleasant in itself, just a focusing of attention. Love is the soul's inclination towards something it judges to be good. Hate is the soul's aversion to something it judges to be bad. Desire is the restless striving for something we lack. It's future-oriented, always reaching toward what isn't yet present. Joy and sadness are responses to what we already have. Joy when we possess something good. Sadness when something bad affects us. All other emotions are combinations or variations. Of these 6, fear is a kind of sadness mixed with desire to avoid harm. Hope is desire mixed with the belief that what we want is possible. Anger is desire for revenge mixed with a kind of assertive strength. But why does Descartes care about cataloging emotions? Because understanding the passions is key to mastering them, and mastering them is key to living well. Remember, Descartes was influenced by Stoic philosophy, which emphasized that happiness comes from controlling what's in your power, your reactions, rather than trying to control what isn't external circumstances. The passions, arising as they do from the body's influence on the mind, aren't fully under our direct control. I can't simply decide not to feel fear when facing danger, or grief when someone dies, but I can influence the passions indirectly, by directing my attention, by cultivating certain habits of thought, by reasoning about what's truly good and bad. I can shape how I feel when fear arises. I don't have to be controlled by it. I can examine whether the threat is real, whether the fear is proportionate, whether acting on it would be wise. The passion itself might not be voluntary, but my response to it can be. This is where free will comes in. For Descartes, the will is the faculty by which we affirm or deny, pursue or avoid. It's the power of choice. The will is purely mental-lit, belongs to the mind, not the body, and it's where human freedom resides. No matter what passions arise from my bodily nature, no matter what circumstances I'm in, I can always choose how to respond. Even if I can't eliminate sadness when grieving, I can choose not to be consumed by it. Even if I can't prevent fear when threatened, I can choose to act courageously despite it. This emphasis on the will's freedom is crucial to Descartes' ethics. What makes a person virtuous isn't having the right feelings automatically, but choosing rightly even when feelings pull in other directions. The ideal person, for Descartes, has what he calls generosity, a kind of strength of soul that involves both self-esteem and respect for others. A generous soul recognizes their own freedom and dignity, while also recognizing the same in others. This generous person isn't at the mercy of circumstance. They maintain equanimity in the face of fortune and misfortune because they recognize that their true worth lies in their free will, which cannot be taken from them. This might sound abstract, but remember the context of Descartes' life. He lived through wars, religious conflicts, political upheavals. He experienced personal tragedies. His daughter died young. He was embroiled in intellectual controversies. His philosophy of the passions was partly an attempt to maintain personal stability in an unstable world, to find an inner foundation that couldn't be shaken by external events. The Stoics had taught that we should be indifferent to things outside. Our control, health, wealth, reputation, even life itself. What matters is virtue, which is entirely within our control. Descartes adapts this teaching within his dualist framework. The body and its passions are, in a sense, outside the mind's direct control. They happen to us. But our will, our capacity for rational choice, is within our control. And that's what makes us truly human, truly free. It's a vision of human dignity that locates freedom not in our circumstances, but in our consciousness itself. Not in what happens to us, but in how we respond to what happens to us. Whether this vision is ultimately coherent with Descartes' dualism is debatable. If mind and body interact as intimately as our experience suggests, Can they really be as separate as his metaphysics requires? Modern neuroscience suggests that emotion and reason are much more integrated than Descartes imagined. Damage to emotional processing areas of the brain impairs rational decision-making. Emotions aren't just obstacles to clear thinking, they're essential to it. We need to feel appropriately, to think appropriately. The neat separation between passion, bodily and will mentor breaks down under closer examination. Our capacity for choice seems to depend on neurological structures, to be shaped by brain chemistry, to be influenced by factors we're not consciously aware of. And yet, something in Descartes' vision remains compelling. The idea that we're not simply determined by biology and circumstance, that we have a capacity for stepping back, evaluating, choosing, that we're responsible for our responses, even if we're not responsible for our circumstances or our initial reactions. Whether we cash this out in terms of substance dualism or not, the phenomenology rings true. We experience ourselves as having some freedom, some ability to direct our lives, even within constraints. And the ethical project Descartes outlines understanding our passions, managing them through reason, cultivating strength of soul remains valuable regardless of metaphysical details. But Descartes wasn't just a moralist and metaphysician. He was also a scientist, and his scientific work, though less famous than his philosophy, was extensive and influential. Let's turn to that side of his legacy, to Descartes, the scientist, the mathematician, the natural philosopher who helped create the modern scientific worldview. Descartes lived during one of the most exciting periods in human intellectual history, the scientific revolution. Copernicus had proposed that the Earth orbits the Sun. Galileo had turned a telescope to the heavens and seen moons orbiting Jupiter. Kepler had described planetary orbits as ellipses. Harvey had discovered the circulation of blood, the old Aristotelian science, which had dominated for nearly 2,000 years, was crumbling. A new science was being born, based not on ancient authority, but on observation, experiment. And mathematics. Descartes was a major player in this revolution. While we remember him primarily as a philosopher, he saw himself as a scientist, or, in the language of his time, a natural philosopher. His greatest mathematical achievement was the invention of analytic geometry, the coordinate system still called Cartesian coordinates in his honor. Before Descartes, geometry and algebra were separate branches of mathematics. Geometry dealt with shapes, lines, and figures. Algebra dealt with equations and operations on numbers. They were studied using completely different methods. Descartes' brilliant insight was to unite them. He realized that every geometric figure could be described algebraically using equations, and every equation could be represented geometrically as a curve or surface. The key was the coordinate system. By placing a point on a plane and drawing two perpendicular lines through it, the x and y axes, every point on the plane could be uniquely identified by two numbers, x coordinate and y coordinate. A circle could be described by the equation x squared plus y squared equals r squared, where r is the radius. A line could be described by y equals mx plus b, where m is the slope and b is the y-intercept. More complex curves could be described by more complex equations. This was revolutionary. It meant that geometric problems could be solved using algebraic techniques, and algebraic problems could be visualized geometrically. The two branches of mathematics were revealed to be different aspects of the same reality. This unification had profound implications. It suggested that perhaps all of nature could be described mathematically. If space itself could be captured in equations, maybe motion, force, matter, everything physical could be too. This was the heart of Descartes' mechanical philosophy. He believed that the entire physical world could be explained in terms of matter and motion, with all phenomena reducible to the mechanical interactions of particles. Animals, in Descartes' view, were essentially biological machines. They lacked consciousness, lacked souls. They operated purely through mechanical principles, like complex automatons. Their seemingly purposeful behaviors could be explained through reflexes and mechanical responses to stimuli. This was a shocking claim. People had always assumed animals felt pain, had desires, experienced emotions. Descartes was saying, no, animals are just machines, and what looks like feeling is just mechanical response. Why did he hold this view? Because in his dualist metaphysics, consciousness belongs exclusively to mind, and mind is a completely separate substance from body. Humans have minds and bodies. Animals, Descartes thought, have only bodies. Therefore, they're not conscious. This position has been widely criticized, both in Descartes' time and since. Common sense suggests animals do feel pain, do have experiences, and modern biology has confirmed that animal brains have similar structures to human brains, suggesting similar capacities for sensation. But set aside the question of animal consciousness. The broader point is that Descartes was trying to develop a purely mechanistic physics, one that explained natural phenomena without appealing to purposes, goals, or hidden qualities. Medieval science had explained things teleologically in terms of what they were trying to achieve. Fire rises because it seeks its natural place. Seeds grow into plants because they're actualizing their potential. Nature abhors a vacuum. Descartes rejected all this. Natural phenomena occur through efficient causation, one thing pushing or pulling another nut through purposes or goals. The universe is like a vast machine, and to understand it, we need to understand the machine's mechanics, not its supposed purposes. This mechanical philosophy was liberating for science. It suggested that nature was intelligible, that it operated according to mathematical laws we could discover through observation and reasoning. Descartes worked on optics, discovering independently of Snell the law of refraction, how light bends when passing from one medium to another. He experimented with rainbows, explaining how raindrops act as prisms, breaking white light into colors. He developed a theory of the universe based on vortices swirling patterns of matter that, he thought, explained planetary motion. While his specific vortex theory was wrong, Newton's gravitational theory replaced it. The mathematical approach was right. He dissected animals to understand anatomy. He studied meteorology, trying to explain clouds, rain, snow, and wind mechanically. He theorized about the formation of the earth and the origin of mountains and valleys. Not all of his scientific theories were correct. Many were wrong. His physics was overthrown by Newton within a few decades. But his method, the application of mathematics and mechanics too, natural phenomena, was revolutionary and enduring. Perhaps even more important was his emphasis on method itself. The Discourse on Method, published in 1637, outlined his approach to knowledge. The method had 4 rules. Never accept anything as true unless you clearly perceive it to be so. Avoid prejudice and hasty judgment. Divide each problem into as many parts as possible. To solve each part more easily, start with the simplest, most easily known things, and progress gradually to more complex knowledge. Make complete and reviews to ensure nothing is overlooked. This sounds simple, even obvious, but it was a radical departure from the medieval approach of relying on ancient authorities and engaging in purely verbal disputes. Descartes was saying, don't trust what Aristotle said, or what Scripture seems to imply, or what your teacher claims. Think for yourself. Break problems down. Start from first principles. Build up systematically. This is the scientific method in embryonic form. And it's a deeply democratic epistemology. Knowledge isn't the province of authorities or elites. Anyone who reasons carefully can discover truth. This democratization of knowledge was one of the Enlightenment's great gifts, and Descartes was one of its architects. His influence on subsequent science and philosophy was enormous. The next generation of scientists and philosophers, Newton, Spinoza, Leibniz, Locke, all defined themselves partly in response to Descartes, whether agreeing or disagreeing with him. The vision of nature as a mathematical machine operating according to deterministic laws dominated physics for centuries. Only in the 20th century, with quantum mechanics, did this vision have to be qualified, and even beyond his specific scientific contributions, Descartes represented a new ideal, the person who uses reason fearlessly to question everything, and build knowledge anew from secure foundations. In an age of religious warfare and dogmatism, this was a revolutionary stance. And it's one that still resonates. But we've been focusing on Descartes' ideas in isolation, as if they were merely intellectual puzzles. To truly understand his philosophy, we need to see it in a different light, as a spiritual exercise, a practice of transformation. The meditations weren't meant to be just read, they were meant to be done, to be experienced. Let's consider that dimension now. When Descartes titled his masterwork, Meditations de Prima Philosophia Meditations, on First Philosophia Meditations, on First Philosophia, chose that word carefully. Meditations, not treatise, not inquiry, not system. Meditations. Why? Because the work was meant to be practiced, not just studied. The reader wasn't supposed to merely understand Descartes' arguments. They were supposed to go through the process themselves, to doubt, to seek certainty, to discover their own existence, to prove God for themselves. Descartes structures the work over 6 days, 6 meditations. This isn't arbitrary. It echoes the 6 days of creation in Genesis. Just as God created the world in 6 days, the meditator will recreate their knowledge of the world in 6 meditations. But it also echoes something else. Ignatius of Loyola's Spiritual Exercises. Descartes was educated by Jesuits, and the spiritual exercises were a key part of Jesuit formation. This was a month-long program of guided prayer, meditation, and contemplation designed to transform the practitioner spiritually. The exercises involved vivid imagining of biblical scenes, examination of conscience, confrontation with one's sins, and ultimately, a deepening relationship with God. The retreatant was meant to experience, not just think about, the truths of faith. Descartes' meditations adapt this structure for philosophical purposes. Instead of imaginatively entering biblical scenes, the meditator imaginatively enters philosophical thought experiments, the evil demon, the piece of wax, the idea of God. Instead of examining sins, the meditator examines beliefs, testing each one for certainty. Instead of moving from purgation through illumination to union with God, the meditator moves from radical doubt through the discovery of the cogito to the proof of God's existence and the validation of reason. This parallel isn't accidental. Descartes was using the most powerful transformative practice he knew, the spiritual exercises, and adapting it for epistemological purposes. The result is a work that operates on two levels. On the surface, it's a series of philosophical arguments, but deeper, it's a psychological and spiritual journey. It's meant to change you, not just inform you. When you really do the meditations, when you try to genuinely doubt everything, feel the vertigo of that doubt, and then experience the relief of finding certainty, you're not just learning philosophy. You're undergoing a transformation of consciousness. You're stripping away all the accumulated opinions, prejudices, and unexamined assumptions you've been carrying. You're achieving a kind of philosophical rebirth, emerging with a clearer, more methodical way of thinking. This is why Descartes writes in the first person. Not one might doubt, but I doubt. Not the self exists, but I exist. The use of I throughout creates identification. The reader becomes the meditator. Your existence, your doubt, your discovery of certainty. It's also why each meditation ends where it does, often on a note of uncertainty or transition. Descartes wants you to stop, reflect, let the thoughts settle before moving to the next stage. The 6-day structure enforces this pacing. You're not supposed to rush through the meditations in one sitting. You're supposed to live with each meditation, to let the doubts really sink in, to give the arguments time to work on you. Of course, few modern readers actually use the work this way. We tend to read it as we'd read any philosophy book, analytically, critically, trying to evaluate the arguments. And that's legitimate. The arguments are there to be analyzed. But something is lost when we only read that way. We miss the intended experience. To recapture it, you'd need to actually try the method of doubt yourself. Not just think, oh, Descartes doubted whether he had a body, but actually try to doubt whether you have a body. Sit with that doubt. Feel its strangeness. Try to imagine, really imagine, that everything you're experiencing might be a dream or a demon's illusion. Hold that possibility in your mind. Notice how it feels, the disorientation, the insecurity, the craving for something solid. And then discover the cogito for yourself. Not as something Descartes said, but as something you realize. I'm doubting, which means I'm thinking, which means I exist. Oh, I can't doubt that. Feel the shift from uncertainty to certainty. Feel the relief, the grounding, the aha. This is philosophy as practice, not just as theory. And it's something we've largely lost in modern academic philosophy, which tends to treat philosophical texts as collections of arguments, to be evaluated rather than exercises to be practiced. But in Descartes' time, philosophy was still understood partly as a way of life, a spiritual discipline. The ancient Stoics, Epicureans, and skeptics hadn't just had theories. They'd had practices aimed at achieving ataraxia, tranquility, or eudaimonia. Flourishing Descartes was reviving this conception. His method of doubt was a kind of asceticism, stripping away of false beliefs, analogous to fasting or poverty as spiritual disciplines. His emphasis on clear and distinct perception was a training of attention, learning to distinguish real insight from confused opinion. His proof of God's existence was meant to ground the meditator in a relationship with ultimate reality, providing a foundation for all subsequent knowledge, and his ultimate goal achieving certainty about the external world and rebuilding knowledge on secure foundations was meant to provide intellectual peace, freedom from the skeptical anxiety that had plagued him as a young man. This is what makes the Meditations more than just an epistemological treatise. It's a vision of the philosophical life, a life dedicated to clarity, certainty, and truth, achieved through rigorous self-examination and methodical thinking, whether we accept Descartes' specific conclusions or not. This vision of philosophy as transformative practice remains compelling, and it's worth noting, many of the people who've been most influenced by Descartes didn't necessarily agree with all his arguments. What influenced them was the stance he modeled, the willingness to question everything, the commitment to thinking for oneself, the faith that reason could provide a foundation for knowledge. This stance became definitive of modern philosophy, and, more broadly, of the modern intellectual temperament before Descartes. Intellectual authority was largely external in ancient texts, in church teachings, in established traditions. After Descartes, intellectual authority became increasingly internal in what you yourself can clearly perceive, what you yourself can rationally demonstrate, what you yourself can verify. This is the birth of the modern thinking subject, the individual consciousness as the measure of reality. For better or worse, we're all Cartesians now in this sense. But what has this legacy actually amounted to? How did Descartes shape the centuries that followed? When historians of philosophy talk about modern philosophy, they usually date its beginning to Descartes. Not because earlier philosophy was primitive or unimportant, but because Descartes represented a fundamental shift in how philosophy was done and what it was about. What was this shift? Before Descartes, philosophy in the Western tradition was primarily focused outward on the nature of reality, the structure of the cosmos, the essence of things. Medieval philosophy asked, what is God? What is being? What makes something what it is? After Descartes, philosophy became increasingly focused inward on the knowing subject, on consciousness, on how we can have knowledge at all. Modern philosophy asks, how do I know? What is the relationship between mind and world? How does representation work? This is called the epistemological turn, the shift from metaphysics, study of reality, to epistemology, study of knowledge as philosophy's central concern, and it starts with Descartes, with his decision to begin philosophy not from the world, but from the thinking subject, not from what exists, but from what can I know. This had enormous consequences. First, it made the problem of skepticism central to philosophy. If we start from the isolated thinking subject, how do we ever get outside our own minds to know anything about external reality? The evil demon hypothesis raises this problem in its starkest form. Philosophers after Descartes spent enormous energy trying to solve or dissolve this problem. Can we prove the external world exists? Can we justify our belief in it? Or do we just have to accept it as a basic assumption? John Locke, writing half a century after Descartes, tried to build knowledge up from sensory experience, but he ran into his own skeptical problems. If we only experience our own ideas, mental representations, how do we know they correspond to external objects? George Berkeley took Descartes' insights in a radically different direction, arguing that only minds and ideas exist. Matter is just a confused concept. Reality is purely mental. What we call physical objects are just patterns in our experiences caused by God's mind. David Hume pushed skepticism even further, questioning not just knowledge of external objects, but causation, the self-induction-y claim going beyond immediate experience. Immanuel Kant then tried to respond to Hume by showing how knowledge is possible despite these skeptical challenges. His solution involved a radically new conception of how mind structures experience not receiving reality, passively but actively shaping it according to built-in categories. All of this debate rationalism versus empiricism, realism versus idealism, the nature of causation, the problem of induction. The structure of experience can be traced back to the questions Descartes raised. Second, Descartes created what's called the problem of other minds. If I can only directly know my own consciousness, how do I know other people are conscious? Maybe they're just sophisticated zombies, behaving as if conscious, but having no inner experience. This sounds paranoid, but it follows from Descartes' starting point. I have privileged access to my own mind, but only behavioral evidence for others. Minds. How do I infer from behavior to consciousness? This problem still troubles philosophy of mind. We don't have a fully satisfactory solution. We just kind of assume other people are conscious because it would be bizarre and impractical not to. But philosophically, the inference from outward behavior to inner experience isn't as certain as we'd like. Third, Descartes established dualism as the default position about mind and body, a position that had to be accepted, rejected, or modified, but couldn't be ignored. Every subsequent philosopher of mind has had to take a stance on the mind-body problem as Descartes framed it. Are mental and physical truly distinct substances? Or is one reducible to the other? Or are they two aspects of one substance? Or is the whole framing confused? These questions dominate philosophy of mind even today, though now they're informed by neuroscience and cognitive science in ways Descartes couldn't have imagined. Fourth, and more broadly, Descartes helped establish the modern scientific worldview. Idea that nature is fundamentally mathematical, that it operates according to deterministic laws, that understanding it requires stripping away subjective appearances to grasp objective structure. This view was revolutionary and fruitful. It enabled the tremendous progress of physics, chemistry, biology. The natural sciences, as we know them, are partly Descartes' legacy, but it also created problems. If nature is just matter in motion, where does consciousness fit? Where does meaning, value, purpose? Are these real or just subjective projections? This is what Max Weber called the disenchantment of the world, the loss of intrinsic meaning and value in nature once we adopt the mechanical, mathematical worldview. We're still grappling with this. How do we reconcile the scientific image of humans as biological machines with the manifest image of ourselves as conscious, free, purposeful beings? Fifth, Descartes represented a new ideal of the intellectual, the independent thinker who questions authority and builds knowledge from Reason alone, this ideal animated the Enlightenment. It underlay the scientific revolution, the development of modern democracy, the spread of education, the idea that anyone who thinks carefully can discover truth, not just authorities, not just elites, a democratizing, liberating idea. But it also has its dangers. The Cartesian ideal of the isolated thinking subject, stripped to tradition and community, building knowledge from scratch, can lead to an atomistic individualism that undervalues social knowledge, embodied practices, and inherited wisdom. The pendulum has swung back in recent philosophy. There's been renewed attention to the social dimensions of knowledge, to the role of the body in cognition, to how practices and cultures shape thinking. But even these critiques are often framed in relation to Descartes. He set the terms of debate so effectively that we're still arguing with him centuries later. In popular culture, Descartes is probably best known for, I think, therefore I am often misunderstood as a kind of abstract rationalism disconnected from life. But as we've seen, the real Descartes was more complex. Yes, he emphasized reason and mathematics, but he also wrote about emotions, about embodiment, about how to live. He wasn't just a disembodied intellect contemplating pure abstractions, and the Cogito itself, while it emphasizes thinking, is really about existence. It's an existential claim more than an abstract logical one. It's about finding a ground of certainty in the midst of radical doubt, about securing one's existence against all possible skepticism. In this sense, Descartes anticipates existentialism philosophy, focused on human existence, freedom, and meaning. The later existentialists, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Sartre, often positioned themselves against Descartes, but they shared his concern with the individual subject confronting a potentially meaningless universe. So Descartes' legacy is multifaceted. He's the father of modern epistemology, the creator of the mind-body problem, a pioneer of mathematical physics, an advocate of methodical doubt, a philosopher of consciousness, but he's also been blamed for much of what's wrong with modernity. The split between mind and matter, the isolation of the thinking subject, the reduction of nature to mechanism, the loss of meaning and enchantment. Whether this blame is fair is debatable. Intellectual movements are complex, with many causes. Descartes was responding to problems and currents in his own time, not trying to create all of modernity single-handedly, but there's no doubt he was a pivotal figure, a hinge point between medieval and modern worldviews, someone who saw that a new way of thinking was needed and did as much as anyone to articulate what that new way should be. Whether his particular solutions were right is less important than that he posed the questions clearly and compellingly. He set the agenda, and we're still working through it. No philosophy is perfect, and Descartes' philosophy, for all its brilliance, has problems, some of which were pointed out by his contemporaries, others that only became clear later. Let's consider some of the major critiques and alternative approaches that philosophers have developed. Princess Elizabeth and the interaction problem. We've already mentioned Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, who corresponded with Descartes and pressed him on mind-body interaction. Her critique was simple but devastating. If mind is completely non-physical, if it has no extension, no location in space, no physical properties, then how can it causally interact with the body? Causation seems to require contact, or at least spatial relationship. But something non-spatial can't make contact with something spatial. Descartes. The response was essentially to say that we directly experience such interaction when we will our bodies to move. So we shouldn't doubt it just because we can't explain the mechanism. But this wasn't satisfying. It seemed like Descartes was just asserting what needed to be proven. Elizabeth's critique pointed to a fundamental tension in Cartesian dualism. Either mind and body can interact, in which case they can't be as completely different as Descartes claims. Or they're truly completely different, in which case interaction seems impossible. This led later philosophers to develop alternatives. Spinoza's solution, one substance with two attributes. Baruch Spinoza, a younger contemporary of Descartes, proposed that there's only one substance which he identified with God or nature. This substance has infinite attributes, but we know only two. Thought and extension. Mind and body aren't two substances that somehow interact. There are two aspects or ways of conceiving the same reality. Every event is both a mental and a physical description, not because mental causes physical or vice versa, but because they're two sides of the same coin. This elegant solution avoids the interaction problem by denying that mind and body are truly separate. But it raises new questions about identity and causation. Leibniz's solution. Pre-established harmony. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz proposed that mind and body don't interact at all. God created them perfectly synchronized from the beginning, like two clocks showing the same time. When I decide to raise my arm and my arm moves, this isn't causation. It's coincidence, but a divinely orchestrated coincidence. My mental life and my physical life unfold in parallel, perfectly coordinated, without actually influencing each other. This preserves dualism while avoiding the interaction problem. But it seems bizarre. It means my decisions don't actually cause my actions. They just happen to coincide with them. Materialist solutions. Mind reduces to matter as science progressed. Especially with the development of neuroscience, many philosophers concluded that consciousness must somehow be physical after all. Maybe mental states just are brain states. Maybe feeling pain is just a folk term for certain neural processes. Maybe consciousness will ultimately be explained in purely physical terms. This approach, called materialism or physicalism, has the advantage of fitting with scientific practice. Science studies only physical things, and it seems to be making progress on understanding consciousness neurologically. But it faces what David Chalmers calls the hard problem. Even if we fully understand which brain states correlate with which experiences, we still haven't explained why there's subjective experience at all. Why does it feel like something to be conscious? Idealist solutions. Matter reduces to mind. George Berkeley took the opposite approach. He argued that only minds and ideas exist. What we call matter is just a confused concept. Physical objects, in Berkeley's view, are collections of idea-stable patterns in our experience that God causes. The table exists as an idea in my mind, your mind, and God's mind. It's not a material substance underlying those ideas. This avoids the mind-body problem by eliminating one of the terms body. But it seems counterintuitive. Surely rocks and trees exist even when no human is perceiving them. Berkeley's response: they exist in God's mind. God is always perceiving everything. Phenomenological critiques. The Cartesian theatre in the 20th century. Phenomenologists like Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger critiqued Descartes' approach from a different angle. They argued that Descartes had adopted a detached, spectatorial view of consciousness, as if the mind were an inner theatre where ideas appear before a viewing subject. But this gets consciousness wrong. Consciousness isn't primarily about detached observation of ideas. It's about engaged involvement with the world. We're not primarily spectators, but actors, practically coping with our environment. Heidegger argued that Descartes' starting point, radical doubt, is artificial. We don't naturally doubt the external world. We're always already immersed in it, dealing with it practically. The skeptical stance is a derivative, abnormal attitude, not the natural or basic one. The phenomenologists advocated returning to lived experience, to how things actually show up for us, pre-theoretically, before we adopt philosophical theories. From this perspective, the mind-body problem is a pseudo-problem created by bad theory. If we start from lived experience, we find that we're embodied beings in the world, not disembodied minds contingently attached to bodies. Embodied cognition. Mind depends on body. Recent cognitive science has developed what's called embodied cognition. The view that thinking depends essentially on having a body. The way we conceptualize abstract things like time, causation, understanding is grounded in bodily experience, movement, manipulation, perception. We think metaphorically, using bodily schemas as sources for abstract concepts. If this is right, then mind can't be separated from body in the way Descartes imagined. Thought requires embodiment, not just contingently, but essentially. Social epistemology. Knowledge is social. Another critique points out that Descartes' method is radically individualistic. He begins with the isolated thinking subject and tries to build all knowledge from that starting point. But actual knowledge is social. We learn from others, rely on testimony, participate in communities of inquiry. Science is a collective enterprise, not something individuals do in isolation. Starting from the isolated subject isn't just impracticalite, misunderstands the nature of knowledge itself. Knowledge is partly constituted by social practices, not just individual cognition. Feminist critiques, the bias toward disembodiment. Feminist philosophers have pointed out that Descartes' elevation of mind over body, reason over emotion, aligns with traditional gendered hierarchies, where masculine is associated with mind, reason, and feminine with body emotion. His ideal knower is disembodied, dispassionate, detached qualities, traditionally coded masculine. This isn't just a coincidence, but reflects biases about who counts as a proper knower. A more adequate epistemology, feminists argue, should recognize the importance of embodiment, emotion, and social location in knowledge production. Pragmatist critiques focus on practice. American pragmatists like Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, and John Dewey argued that Descartes' method of doubt is impossible and unnecessary. We can't actually doubt everything at once. We can only doubt particular beliefs when we have specific reasons to. And in practice, we navigate the world successfully by acting on beliefs until we encounter problems. The pragmatists advocated fallibilism, acknowledging that our beliefs might be wrong, remaining open to revision without requiring absolute certainty as a foundation. Knowledge grows through inquiry, through solving problems, through testing beliefs in practice. We don't need Cartesian certainty. We need beliefs that work, that prove themselves reliable in experience. All these critiques share something. Notice that most of these critiques don't deny that Descartes asked important questions. They accept that the mind-body problem, the problem of skepticism, the nature of consciousness, these are genuine philosophical issues. What they dispute are Descartes' specific answers and his methodological approach. But the fact that we're still arguing about these questions, still developing new solutions, testifies to the depth and importance of the problems Descartes identified. A bad philosopher poses questions that turn out to be pseudo-problems or confusions. A great philosopher poses questions that remain genuine and important even when their own answers are rejected. Descartes is unquestionably a great philosopher by this standard. His solutions may be wrong, but his questions remain vital. And that's perhaps the best way to engage with historical philosophy, not as dogma to be accepted or rejected wholesale, but as conversation partners raising questions that still matter, proposing solutions we can learn from, even when we ultimately disagree. So, what can we learn from Descartes today? What's the enduring value of his thought? We've explored Descartes' philosophy in depth, his method of doubt, his cogito, his dualism, his scientific work, his critics. But what does it all mean for us? What can we take from Descartes' thought into our own lives? Let's consider some existential lessons, ways Descartes' philosophy speaks to the human condition. Even if we don't accept all his specific claims, the courage to question first, and most obviously, Descartes exemplifies intellectual courage. He was willing to question everything, to subject even his most cherished beliefs to scrutiny. This is harder than it sounds. We're all invested in our beliefs. They give us comfort, structure, identity. Genuinely questioning them, really entertaining the possibility they might be wrong, is psychologically difficult, but it's also liberating. Beliefs we've never questioned are like chains we don't know we're wearing. Only by testing them can we distinguish genuine knowledge from mere assumption or prejudice. In our age of information overload, where we're constantly bombarded with claims and counterclaims, Descartes' methodical doubt is more relevant than ever. How do we distinguish truth from misinformation? Expertise from charlatanry, genuine knowledge from confident ignorance? The Cartesian answer: question carefully. Don't accept things just because they're widely believed, or because some authority says so. Use your own reason. Look for clear and distinct evidence. Build your beliefs on secure foundations. This doesn't mean being endlessly skeptical about everything. Descartes himself wasn't. After his methodical doubt, he built up a body of knowledge. The point wasn't permanent skepticism, but finding what could withstand skepticism. Intellectual honesty related to courage is honesty. Descartes was scrupulously honest about what he did and didn't know. When he couldn't prove something, he acknowledged it. When arguments had weaknesses, he usually admitted them. This intellectual honesty is rare and valuable. It's tempting to overstate our knowledge, to claim more certainty than we have, to gloss over difficulties. But genuine understanding requires admitting uncertainty. I don't know is often the most honest and ultimately most productive response. Descartes teaches us to distinguish between what we truly know with certainty, what we believe with good evidence, and what we're merely speculating about. Clarity about our epistemic status is valuable. The search for foundations. Descartes' project was foundationalist. He wanted to find absolutely certain foundations on which to build all knowledge. Most contemporary philosophers think this project fails or is misguided. We don't need absolute certainty, and we can't achieve it anyway. But the underlying impulse is valuable. We should ask, what are the foundations of my beliefs? What am I taking for granted? What assumptions am I building on? Even if we can't achieve Cartesian certainty, we can achieve greater clarity about our assumptions and greater rigor in our reasoning. Living with uncertainty, paradoxically, Descartes, who sought certainty, can teach us how to live with uncertainty, because he pushed doubt so far, because he really confronted the possibility that almost everything might be wrong. He developed psychological resources for handling uncertainty, his provisional moral code, the rules he lived by while doing his philosophical work is a model for this. You can acknowledge uncertainty in your beliefs while still acting decisively. You can remain open to revising your views while still committing to a course of action. In life, we constantly face uncertainty. We don't know what career will work out, what relationship will last, what choice will lead to happiness. We can't wait for certainty before acting. Descartes' approach. Recognize the uncertainty, but act decisively anyway based on your best judgment. And remain open to changing course if you get new evidence. The value of Method 1. Of Descartes' great insights was that having a method is more important than having specific answers. His 4 rules of method from the Discourse on Method are: simple but powerful, accept only what is clear and distinct, divide problems into manageable parts, start with the simplest and build to the complex, review thoroughly to ensure completeness. These aren't profound truths. They're procedural guidelines, but following them can make thinking more effective. In any complex problem, professional, philosophical, having a method helps. Instead of approaching things haphazardly, approach them systematically. The examined life's Descartes practiced philosophy as self-examination. The meditations involve turning inward, examining one's own thoughts, questioning one's own beliefs. This introspective dimension of philosophy connects to the ancient ideal of self-knowledge. Socrates said, "The unexamined life isn't worth living." Descartes would agree. We're capable of stepping back from our experience and reflecting on it. We're capable of thinking about our thinking. This reflexive capacity is part of what makes us human. Using it, regularly examining our beliefs, motivations, assumptions, leads to greater self-awareness and potentially greater wisdom. The limits of reason. While Descartes celebrated reason, he also implicitly showed its limits. He couldn't prove the external world exists by reason alone. He needed God to guarantee it. He couldn't fully explain mind-body interaction. He couldn't answer all of Princess Elizabeth's objections. This is instructive. Reason is powerful, but not omnipotent. Some things remain mysterious. Some questions may not have answers we can comprehend. Recognizing this is different from giving up on reason. It's being realistic about what reason can and can't achieve. It's epistemic humility, finding meaning in consciousness. Perhaps Descartes' deepest lesson is about the significance of consciousness itself. In his journey from doubt to certainty, what saved him? Not the external world that remained uncertain, not his body that could be doubted, not even mathematical truths those could be questioned given an evil demon. What saved him was consciousness itself. The sheer fact of being aware, of thinking, of experiencing. That was indubitable. In our materialistic age, when consciousness is often treated as merely an epiphenomenon of brain processes, something to be explained away, Descartes reminds us of its primacy. Whatever the metaphysical truth about consciousness, whether it's material or immaterial, fundamental or derivative phenomenologically, experientially, it's our entry point to everything. All knowledge, all experience, all meaning comes through consciousness. To recognize this isn't to solve the mind-body problem, but is to acknowledge something irreducibly subjective about existence. To be a conscious being is to have a first person perspective on reality that can't be captured completely in third person. Objective terms. This is what makes each of us unique and valuable. Not our physical properties, those we share with all matter, but our consciousness, our subjective experience, our inner life. Descartes, by starting from the Cogito, was affirming the dignity and significance of the thinking subject. Whatever else we are conscious beings, and that matters philosophy. As a way of life, finally, Descartes exemplifies philosophy as a way of life. Not just an academic discipline. He didn't just write about doubt, he lived it. He didn't just theorize about clear thinking, he practiced it. He didn't just discuss the passions, he tried to master his own. Philosophy, for Descartes, was practical. It was about how to live, how to think, how to find peace and certainty in an uncertain world. This conception of philosophy is increasingly rare in academic settings, where philosophy is often just another specialized discipline producing technical papers for other specialists. But the original conception philosophy as love of wisdom, as a transformative practice, as a path to living well remains compelling, and Descartes, despite his reputation as a cold rationalist, maintained this conception. His philosophy was meant to change you, to give you resources for living better. Whether we accept his dualism, his God proofs, his epistemology, these are important questions. But perhaps equally important is whether we can recapture his sense of philosophy as existentially significant, as something that matters for how we live. We've traveled a long way on this philosophical journey, from radical doubt to certainty, from mind to body, from mathematics to emotions, from theory to practice. But we need to return, at the end, to where we began, to the mystery at the heart of Descartes' philosophy and at the heart of human existence. Consciousness itself. What is it? How does it arise? Why is there something it's like to be conscious? These questions, what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness, were implicit in Descartes' philosophy, though he didn't frame them exactly this way. When Descartes established the Cogito, when he found certainty in the fact that he thinks, therefore exists, he was pointing to something undeniable about consciousness. Right now, in this moment, you're having experiences. You're hearing these words or seeing them if you're reading. You're thinking thoughts. You're aware. This isn't something you infer. It's not something you believe because of evidence. It's something you directly know, immediately, just by having it. The philosopher David Chalmers calls this the easy problem and the hard problem. The easy problem, which is actually very difficult but at least in principle solvable, is explaining the cognitive functions of consciousness, how the brain processes information. how it integrates sensory data, how it produces behavior. Neuroscience is making progress on these questions. We're mapping which brain regions do what. We're understanding neural mechanisms. We're building computational models of cognition. But the hard problem is different. It's the question, why is there subjective experience at all? Why does it feel like something to be conscious? Consider pain. From the outside, we can describe it completely in physical terms. Tissue damage activates nociceptors. Signals travel up neurons to the spinal cord and brain. Certain brain regions activate. Certain behaviors result withdrawal, vocalization. That's the functional story. And it's true as far as it goes. But it leaves something out. The feeling of pain. The hurtfulness. The qualitative, subjective character of the experience. Why does that neural process feel like anything? Why isn't it all just unconscious information processing? This is the hard problem. And after decades of neuroscience research, we're no closer to solving it than Descartes was. Or consider color. We understand the physics' different wavelengths of light, reflected by objects, detected by cone cells in the retina, processed by the visual cortex. But why does 650 nanometer light look red? Why does it have that particular qualitative character? The redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the sweetness of sweet. These qualitative features of experience are called qualia, singular, quali, and they're mysterious. Some philosophers and scientists think qualia will eventually be explained in physical terms. As neuroscience advances, they say, we'll understand how particular neural patterns give rise to particular experiences. Others think this is impossible in principle. Explaining how neurons fire doesn't explain why their firing feels like anything. There's an explanatory gap between the physical and the phenomenal that can't be bridged. This debate connects directly to Descartes' mind-body dualism. If consciousness is fundamentally different from matter of subjective experience, can't be reduced to objective physical processes, then maybe Descartes was right about dualism, even if his specific formulation had problems. But if consciousness somehow emerges from or reduces to physical processes, then dualism is wrong, and we need a different framework. Neither side has won the argument decisively. The hard problem of consciousness remains genuinely hard. What makes it so difficult? Why can't we just study the brain and figure it out? Part of the problem is the first-person, third-person asymmetry. Science studies things from a third-person perspectively, measurably, publicly. But consciousness is inherently first-personal, subjective, qualitative, private. You can't observe my consciousness directly. You can only observe my brain if you open my skull and look, or use imaging technology or my behavior, what I say and do. But my actual experience, what it's like to be is only accessible to me. This creates a methodological difficulty. How do you study scientifically something that's only accessible from one perspective? Descartes was grappling with this problem when he distinguished mind and body so sharply. He saw that consciousness has features subjectivity, privacy, intentionality, that matter doesn't seem to have. Whether this means they're different substances is debatable. But the phenomenological observation seems right. There's something about consciousness that resists being captured in purely physical terms. Some contemporary philosophers have proposed variations on dualism that avoid Descartes' specific problems. Property. Dualism says there's only one kind of substance, physical, but it has two kinds of properties. Physical properties like mass, charge, position, and mental properties like feeling, thinking, experiencing. These mental properties emerge from complex physical organization, but aren't reducible to physical properties. This avoids the interaction. Problemental and physical properties are properties of the same substance, so they can interact. But it still maintains that consciousness is something over and above physical processes. Other philosophers go further, proposing panpsychism, the view that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, present in some form, even in elementary particles. This sounds crazy at first. Electrons are conscious, but panpsychists argue, we know for certain that consciousness exists. Descartes was right about that. We know it emerges somehow from physical processes. But emergence is mysterious. How do you get consciousness from non-conscious matter? Maybe the solution is that matter isn't non-conscious. Maybe even simple physical systems have simple forms of experience, and complex consciousness, like ours, emerges from combining these simple forms. This is highly speculative. Most scientists and philosophers reject it. But it's an attempt to take seriously both the reality of consciousness and the difficulty of explaining it materialistically. What would Descartes make of all this? It's hard to say. He'd probably be fascinated by neuroscience, by our ability to observe the brain in action, to see which regions activate during different mental states. But he might also say, see, even with all this neural data, you still can't explain what it's like to be conscious. The first-person perspective remains irreducible to third-person description. I was right to distinguish mind and matter, and he'd have a point. For all our scientific progress, the hard problem remains. Maybe it's unsolvable. Maybe consciousness will always be mysterious, because the tools we have for understanding things, objective observation, measurement, mathematical description, don't apply to subjective experience. Or maybe we just haven't figured it out yet. Maybe in 50 years, or 100, neuroscience will crack the code. Maybe we'll understand exactly how neural patterns give rise to qualitative experience. But even then, even if we fully explain the correlations between brain states and mental states, will we have explained why there's experience at all? That's the deepest question. And it's the question Descartes was pointing toward when he discovered the cogito. I think, therefore I am. Not I have a brain, therefore I am. Not neurons fire, therefore I am. But I think, I experience, I'm aware, I'm conscious, therefore I am. The primacy of consciousness. The fact that whatever else is true, we can be certain that consciousness exists, because we're directly acquainted with it in our own case. This is Descartes' lasting contribution. Not his specific theories, many of which were wrong, but his recognition that consciousness is philosophically and existentially fundamental. We are, before anything else, conscious beings. And that's something we can't doubt, can't deny, can't explain away. It's the one thing that survives all skepticism, the one thing that remains when everything else is questioned. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's the foundation we need. Not to build a complete system of certain knowledge, Descartes' original ambition, but to ground ourselves in what's undeniable. We exist. We're aware. We experience. That's certain. Everything else is uncertain to some degree. But that certainty, The certainty of consciousness is enough to make life meaningful, to make inquiry worthwhile, to make existence something other than absurd. Because we're not just physical objects following laws. We're subjects. We're conscious. We're aware of ourselves and the world. And in that awareness, in that consciousness, lies everything. That makes us human. We've traveled together through Descartes' philosophical landscape, from the cold November night when he sat in a heated room and dreamed his prophetic dreams, through the radical doubt that questioned everything, to the unshakable certainty of the Cogito, to the proof of God, to the mind-body problem, to the mathematical reorganization of nature, to the mastery of the passions. We've seen his brilliance and his blindness, his insights and his oversights, his courage and his limitations. What have we learned? Perhaps this, that the search for certainty, pushed to its limit, reveals not a system of certain knowledge, but a single certain fact that we exist as conscious beings. Everything else, the external world, other people, even mathematical truths, rests on foundations less certain than we'd like. We can give good reasons for believing in them, but absolute certainty eludes us, and maybe that's okay. Maybe the quest for absolute certainty was always a bit quixotic. Maybe what we need isn't certainty, but clarity. Not indubitable foundations, but careful thinking. Descartes gave us a method for that careful thinking. Question assumptions. Seek clarity. Build systematically. Test rigorously. Remain open to revision. This method is valuable even if it's original. Goal certainty is unattainable. He also gave us something else. A vivid sense that we're not just passive recipients of reality, but active knowers, constructing our understanding through the powers of our own minds. For better or worse, we're Cartesian subjects now. We start from our own consciousness and try to build outward to the world. We recognize that knowledge is always from a perspective, always mediated by our cognitive faculties. This can be us solving the problem of solipsism, of being locked in our own minds, haunts modern philosophy. But it can also be empowering. We're not slaves to authority, tradition, or dogma. We're free thinkers, capable of judging for ourselves. The method of doubt, practiced wisely, is a tool of liberation. And then there's the simple fact of consciousness itself, the sheer miracle of it, that there's something it's like to be you. That you're not just a collection of particles, but a subject of experience. Descartes pointed us toward this miracle. He said, before you ask what the world is, before you ask what you can know about external reality, notice this: you're conscious. You exist, you think, you feel, you wonder. That's primary. That's undeniable. That's the foundation. Everything else is built on that. Science, philosophy, mathematics, art, level of it depends on consciousness. All of it happens within experience. So maybe the ultimate lesson of Descartes is this: be amazed that you exist. Be amazed that you're aware. Be amazed that there's something rather than nothing, and that you're one of the somethings, looking out at the world with wonder. Because wonder, not doubt, is the true beginning of philosophy. Doubt is a method, a tool, a path. But wonder is the spirit in which we walk that path. Why does anything exist? Why is there a universe? Why are we conscious? Why can we think about our own thinking? These are the deepest questions, Descartes asked them. We're still asking them. We may always be asking them, but in the asking itself, there's something beautiful. The fact that we can ask, the fact that we wonder, the fact that we seek understanding, this is what makes us human. Descartes showed us how to doubt courageously, but he also showed us how to think clearly, how to seek truth honestly, how to find certainty where it can be found and acknowledge uncertainty where it can't. His legacy isn't a system of doctrine to be accepted or rejected. It's a model of philosophical inky honest, systematic, bold. And it's an invitation to think for yourself, to question your assumptions, to seek clarity, to wonder about the mystery of your own consciousness. You exist, you think, you're aware that much is certain. Everything else is a journey of discovery. A journey from doubt to understanding, from confusion to clarity, from darkness to light. Thank you for taking this journey with me tonight. Thank you for wandering alongside Descartes. Thank you for being conscious, thinking beings who care about truth, understanding, and meaning. May you find certainty where it can be found. May you live gracefully with uncertainty where it can't. May you think clearly and wonder deeply, and may you never forget the miracle at the heart of it all, that you exist, that you're aware, that you're here. I think, therefore I am. We think, therefore we are. And that's a beautiful truth to rest in. Until we meet again, dear friends, think well and wonder often.